How did Imperial Japan apply air power during World War II? From the early experiences in China, the fateful attack in Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, over to the Southeast Pacific and the home islands, in our growing series, I aim to tackle it all. Recently, I published 4 dedicated episodes as an introduction to this topic together with Justin Pyke. The episode you are listening to here makes 1 out of all these 4. Why? We realized it makes sense to put it all into one mega primer episode to have a baseline reference for viewers like yourself, and as an episode we can continuously refer to in the future. Both Justin and I will continue this series, and many of the questions you have asked in the previous episodes will be answered. Also, instead of just cutting and pasting the 4 episodes into one, we actually went back to the original videos and add additional information and context. These segments will be marked in an obvious manner as you listen through this megasode. As we get started, if you like our research, you can have early access to episodes, vote on topics, and get more benefits by supporting over Patreon and channel memberships. A big thank you go to Oliver, Russ, Bonner, and Grey Papillon for recently signing up.
Right, I think the best way of getting started with this obviously is to remind us that there is the Japanese Navy Air Service, and then there's the Army Air Service, right? So I have that divide because everybody always talks about the Zeros and the Bettys, which were the Navy, weren't they? But as we talk sort of about Japanese fighter tactics, let's go first within the smallest sort of formation size that they had, which differs somewhat to what we see, especially in the European theater, eventually, as well as then in the Pacific amongst the Allies, and that is the Shotai. Now, tell me, Justin, what is the Shotai?
Yeah, so the Shotai's earliest origins were developed straight from the British Vic, perhaps unsurprisingly for people that are more familiar with how particularly the Japanese Navy Air Service developed. There was a lot of British assistance. So a tight 3-plane formation in a V shape. However, in China, both air services discovered that the Shotai proved to be too inflexible in its original form. It was loosened up significantly, and it rarely used a V formation in combat. It instead adopted either line astern or left or right echelon, and then there was enough spacing provided between the individual aircraft to allow maneuver while remaining close enough to provide mutual support. 2 to 3 of these Shotai were grouped together into a Chutai. It's like a 9-plane formation, generally speaking, with each component Shotai operating at different altitudes and intervals to prevent the formation from being surprised. Now, on paper, there were complex Chutai-level maneuvers that could be used once engaged, but the Chutai leader, Chutai-cho, often lost tactical control of the individual Shotai after the initial deployment. Where you see them retain cohesion is usually at the outset of engagements or engagements where they held the initiative for much of it. Like it's actually Midway when they were fighting Thatch. That's actually one example. So the Japanese would eventually adopt Schwarm or Finger 4 formations, but that was well into 1943, at least officially. It is important to note that there were exceptions and earlier experimentation before that, individual units, sometime all the way down to individual like Chutai. They would decide, hey, we're going to try out, 2-plane formations or 4-plane formations. I even have a historian friend who I respect greatly who's said he's seen examples of them playing around with it even in the war in China before the war, but this was not systematized. Now, instead, the Japanese formally, they were kind of content to reform their 3-plane formation instead of adopting a 2- and 4-plane one. It was still a positive change, but the later move toward formalizing Schwarm or Finger 4 demonstrated that they hadn't comprehensively solved the problem, perhaps unsurprisingly for people familiar with other aspects of the air war.
So for most of the air war in the Pacific and Southeast Pacific, it was basically the Japanese fighting in that 3-plane formation, whereas the Allies would eventually go to that 2-plane / 4-plane formation that we're familiar with. Now, just so we sort of understand how a Shotai looks. Now, you said that a Shotai becomes a Chutai once there are 3 Shotais involved, and these are sort of staggered on top of each other. But we think of the WIC, obviously, if I use my fingers here, we think of the WIC sort of as this sort of formation, right? We have the leader, and then on the sides we have the wingman. is there also in the Shotai sort of a staggering of the wingmen, that they're a little bit further out, that they're more spaced out and also staggered in altitude, or are they staying really closely together?
Yeah, so they're, again, like they didn't really use a V formation in combat almost ever. That was cruise flight. So you'll see footage of them, but they're almost all the footage you ever see of Japanese fighters are in cruise flight. But yes, they did stagger in altitude, and they also spaced out between aircraft because, of course, trying to maintain a very tight V formation in combat, that's a lot of work for the pilots, and it was causing issues in combat identical really to what the British experienced.
And then picking up on what you said regarding sort of this loss of control by the Chutai Cho, the Chutai leader. Now, if you look at sort of World War II dogfights, they're very chaotic. Everything is happening left, right, and center, and it's very hard, of course, to keep control of a formation at the best of times. There are a lot of stories regarding the Japanese that there's sort of limited discipline amongst pilots, or that maybe some of the planes didn't have radio equipment. Was this a contributing factor, or are these things just myths that have sort of been perpetuated over the years?
So as far as discipline goes, there's nothing to actually say that they were less disciplined than other air forces. Of course, you can find examples, and I think one of the most famous ones actually is in Sakai's memoir. In one particular action, he's actually quite angry that he felt like Japanese Navy fighter pilots had embarrassed themselves in a particular action where they just broke formation and started chasing a bunch of B-25s at low level.
Can I just ask very quickly, sorry to interrupt, but is this the English translation of Sakai's book?
That's the English, yeah.
Yeah, okay, because that one is...
Yeah,
I think that book is known to have some liberal, liberties taken with the translation. But please continue.
Yeah, and for the most part, they had pretty excellent formation discipline a lot of the time. As long as what really started to work against their cohesion is later in the war, when the average quality of their pilots started to decrease. Because one of the main disadvantages of the Shotai is that it was a 3-plane formation. It still took a lot of effort to maintain cohesion. And when you start getting less experienced pilots, the formation itself is brittle. At its core.
I mean, that goes straight into my next question then. Did the Shotai actually work? Because we always have sort of this image that, the Vic formation was this very rugged, very sluggish, unresponsive formation that really didn't work in favor, especially for the British during the Battle of Britain, until they made some squadron level changes. The Shotai being staggered out a little bit more flexible there, perhaps?
Oh yeah, the way they reformed it with their experience in China made it a completely different formation from the British Vic. This is something I can get a little frustrated by when I read certain authors that seem to assume that it was literally just a British Vic still into the war, and it's just not the case at all. So it was actually quite flexible. Now because of it's a 3-plane formation, there were a lot of complex aerobatic maneuvers that they had to use at times to maintain cohesion in combat. And when outside observers were looking at this, an American pilot not familiar with Japanese tactics other than what they can see flying around at several hundred kilometers an hour, it could look on the surface like Japanese fighter formations were, they've been described as like a swarm of bees, for example, but looks were deceiving. These were not disorganized blobs, and newer research that cross-references Japanese records with Allied ones adds a lot more clarity to how Japanese fighters were operating tactically that sole sourcing from Allied records simply can't do. It's the same thing when discussing the actual combat performance of the Shotai. So one could be forgiven for assuming that the Shotai or Japanese fighters generally didn't meet with much success beyond the initial stages of the war, because that's really the traditional narrative of the Asia-Pacific Air War is one of rapid Japanese decline. Frankly, it's a major error, and it's driven by virtually no one using Japanese operational records to assess actual loss rates, and instead they rely exclusively on Allied overclaiming to measure tactical success. So it looks like you're looking at various air actions in 43, and you're like, oh, well, they shot down 50 Zeros in this engagement, and they lost 10 aircraft. So, of course, the Japanese are suffering greatly. It's no, the Allies overclaimed by 5, 6, 7 times. And I'm actually reading a great book by Michael Claringbold that you've had on the channel before on Operation Rogo in late 1943. And that operation is not a stunning Japanese victory at all. In fact, it's so obscure that I'm sure many people have never heard of it. It's almost unmentioned in English language sources because it kind of gets tied up in the Bougainville landings. But you look at individual tactical actions, and against Corsairs, even in late 1943, it's like Zeros are holding their own, sometimes doing quite a bit better. So it's
that's sort of tactical level victories there, or like tactical level stalemates there in the area.
Yeah. And as far as communication goes, now that is a very different story. So the radios, particularly in the Zero, were notoriously unreliable. And it's just, there was poor shielding on the radios. There's a lot of atmospheric interference, particularly in the South Pacific. And these factors combined together, and the radios in a lot of the land-based Zeros in particular, they just ripped them out because they just felt like we'd rather save a few kilograms of weight than try to lug these things around that don't work. So they were largely down to hand signals, rocking wings, that kind of thing, pretty much straight out of the First World War. Did it work? I mean, often it did, but then there are other times where, you're stuck in clouds or whatever, which would build up over the South Pacific quite frequently. And it's like, well, you can't communicate with anyone around you. You don't know if one part of the formation has been attacked. It would definitely cause problems. And that was, I would say, probably the number one reason why sometimes you would see formations break apart, or part of a Chutai would just fly onto the target while the other part was engaged and they had no idea.
Okay. And this sounds a little bit from what you've been saying is tactically, the Japanese are able to hold themselves for a fairly long time. But as we've discussed in the past already on certain videos, is that operationally, this is where things really start getting problematic for them by sort of the mid-war period. And if we were to point at previous videos, for example, the air raids on Wewak and Wewak and Hollandia, right, are the ones where the Japanese basically lose their air fleet in the South Pacific twice over in a matter of basically a year. So those things are probably a little bit more significant to what the air war changed as than sort of the tactical level engagements where the planes were still holding their own. Regarding sort of the point you've made about the sourcing in the Japanese records, that these weren't used, I mean, this is changing nowadays, right? If we just make a very quick intermission and glance at sort of the historiography and the new research coming out, there is, I think, quite a lot of progress made in the last couple of years, building up on some of that foundational work that was done in the last 20 years.
Yeah, and Michael Claringbold is really the guy that stands above all else, particularly beyond 42. And another name I should mention that I hold great respect for is John Lundstrom, and he was writing back in the 80s, 90s, where he was probably the first, like outside of maybe a few scattered Osprey authors as well, who deserve a lot of respect, like Tagaya Samu and others. Henry Sakaido is another one. But yeah, there's a handful out there. They're really good if you want to grasp what was going on the Japanese side and actually comparing losses. With using the records from both sides instead of just kind of going with one side. And by the way, it's not, again, it shouldn't be new to people for your channel, but I'm not saying that the Allies overclaimed and the Japanese didn't, because, oh boy, the Japanese overclaimed.
I mean, when you look at any engagement during World War II, both sides are going to overclaim.
Oh,
it's just how it is. And yeah, for anybody who's interested, we'll provide sources and recommendations in the comments below, and there you can find a good number of books and sources for your reading pleasure. But now moving on a little bit, now we of course think of World War II sort of as this big standoff between the Japanese, mainly the Navy, and of course the US, with that typical comparison being the turn and burn fighting Japanese aircraft that's very light, has a very short turning circle, and then those heavier, more quote-unquote rugged planes of the Allies that are doing the boom and zooming. And that is sort of the visual that we have of these dogfights. But what were the Navy's tactics actually like?
And this is something that you can witness the development of Japanese Navy fighter tactics all the way back to the war in China, of course. And the typical characterization of that fighter combat in China was, as you described, close-in dogfights, horizontal maneuvering was the rule. And this is from my research and that of others, it's frankly incorrect. So hit and run tactics were first used against the Japanese not by the Americans, but by Soviet pilots that were fighting in China, and they were seeking to leverage the superior dive characteristics of their I-16s relative to Japanese fighter opposition. This was identified by a U.S. Navy attaché in China in November 1937, so very early on into the war, after he acquired a copy of, get this, a Soviet directive telling their pilots not to turn fight the Japanese. And of course, this is very similar to what would later happen in the Asia Pacific War with the Western Allies.
And then, sort of, as we then look at, this directive, of course, how do Japanese Navy pilots sort of move away from perhaps this sort of turn fighting that's very much sort of 1930s still? I mean, we've got to consider that this is just coming out of the biplane era as well. In many ways, we're still using biplanes, with the I-16 being one of the first monoplane fighters out there. How are they shifting away from that?
Yeah, and they start to shift away from turn fighting as their preferred method quite early on. So there's examples I found from January 38. I'm sure there's probably ones earlier than that, where A5Ms, so this is like the predecessor to the Zero. It's even more maneuverable than the Zero is. They would dive in from above, engage the target, use their airspeed gained in the dive to zoom out ahead, and then they would rapidly climb back up to altitude. And, in 1941, American intelligence report, they summarized Japanese fighter tactics, and they did it so well that I'm just going to read the quote, probably put it up on screen as well. So, quote, Chinese pilots report that the Japanese will not engage in a turning duel, but like to make a diving attack and then a steep climb. The Chinese Russian-designed planes cannot follow in a climb, and if they fall off, or when the Japanese otherwise gets a good altitude advantage, he kicks his plane over and dives again on the Chinese planes, which may be nearly stalled. The Chinese find the enemy's zooming tactics hard to neutralize, end quote. Now, this would continue into the Asia-Pacific War, of course. So John Lundstrom, perhaps unsurprisingly, is still one of the only historians to have emphasized this in his excellent work on Japanese and American naval air combat in 1941-42. He notes that Japanese Navy fighter pilots were trained in and relied upon a set of tactics that were very similar to those in the U.S. Navy. So hit-and-run tactics, deflection shooting, and teamwork. Probably the most common mistake that John Lundstrom identifies when he was going through all of these combat reports was not Zero pilots just turn fighting everyone they could find, but to pull into their zoom climbs too quickly after hit-and-run firing passes, and that would give Allied pilots a brief window to fire on the Zero as they were climbing up and out of range. Now, Japanese Navy fighter pilots, they were taught only to engage when tactical conditions were favorable, such as having an altitude advantage. You're like, well, no, duh. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this stuff is because for a lot of the historiography, it was insinuated that the Japanese were somehow not doing this kind of thing, which is just flatly incorrect. I mean, they were fighting for years in China, and they learned the hard way, like many other air forces did, that the days of just turn fighting everything you find and not trying to leverage any kind of advantage you can get is not the path to success. And I guess one last thing I'll mention that's directly related to my main research area, which is U.S. intelligence assessments of Japanese air power and naval power in the interwar years, is that the accurate reporting of Japanese fighter tactics in China led to confusion about the flight characteristics of the Zero, because there was an assumption that developed that since Japanese Navy pilots were not opting to turn fight in their Zeros, that the Zero itself lacked maneuverability. And you can see this in a variety of reports for the U.S. Army Air Corps and in the U.S. Navy as well. It actually makes it into the manual, that the aircraft identification manual right before the war, that the Zero lacks maneuverability, and obviously it's wrong, but without the benefit of hindsight, you can recognize that, like, when they're observing all these Japanese pilots and they're using energy fighting vertical maneuvers, they don't want to turn. It's a reasonable assumption to make that, well, it's because their aircraft can't turn.
Well, that was certainly then a rude awakening for the intelligence community after the Japanese Zero started engaging U.S. Wildcats and whatnot. But now we've talked about the Navy and the Army. From what I gather, the Army is a lot more sort of old school in their tactics.
So as a little addition here, before we go into the section on the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, we did receive, after the launch of the original episode, some really kind feedback from Eugen Pinnock. He's a historian who knows a lot about the Japanese side of World War II as well. And he pointed out we may have created the impression that the Navy was out there booming and zooming all the time, and that the army was really just set in their way with turning and burning. And he's provided a lot of information on that as well to provide some input in why that is not the case. So while you're going through the next section, keep in mind that yes, there are always going to be differences in the way that the Army fought and the Navy fought, and also individual pilots within those formations. But it's not just a case of blanket statement that the Army always did turning and burning. But Justin, you have way more on this, so I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, so it was a really great thread to read. I correspond actually quite regularly with Eugen. He really knows his stuff.
Actually, we'll link it in the comments as well. That his comments.
Yeah, for sure. And so basically, in brief, the Japanese Army Air Service was also trending away. So again, we kind of got into it, or we will get into it, I guess, in the way this is edited, where they are paying attention to fighter trends in Europe. They are developing in the 1930s certain aircraft that are emphasizing other characteristics instead of low-speed maneuverability, like the Ki-28, for example, which I actually mentioned without specifically naming it in the technology video, part 4 of this. But it loses the fighter competition to the Ki-27. However, the design philosophy behind the Ki-28 was very much emphasizing other characteristics other than low-speed maneuverability. Now, one reason Eugen notes for the Japanese Army kind of reacting the way they did at Nomonhan is that they had met such sporadic aerial opposition in North China up to that point that they hadn't had the same kind of baptism by fire that the Japanese Navy Air Service had in central China against the bulk of Chinese fighter opposition. So they had a little bit more wriggle room in North China. Whenever they happened to run into fighters, they could do a lot more dogfighting. And then, of course, that changed in a big way with Nomonhan. And I will also kind of add that in the case of like the Japanese Army Air Service, they weren't always behind the Navy when it came to thinking about fighter tactics. So they were actually the first of the two services to formally move away from 3-plane formations for fighters. That occurred in 1943, as opposed to the Japanese Navy Air Service, which, from what I can discern, that they went away in 1944. Exactly where in 1944, I have a hunch it was probably alongside, there was a major reorganization of the Japanese Navy Air Service in, I believe, March of 1944, if I recall correctly, but it's around there in 1944. Now, again, I have to note that several Japanese Navy Air Service fighter units had informally moved away far earlier than that. In fact, you can even see archive footage of large numbers of Zeros that were scrambling to defend Rabaul in 1943, and they were all in 4 ships. There were no 3-plane Shotais left. So again, what's on paper and what happened in reality, quite different. Now, on the side of the Japanese Navy, for their emphasis on hit and run, Eugen wanted us to maybe add a little bit of detail behind that from before the war in China. So really from 1936, per the Japanese Navy, carrier fighters were envisioned as interceptors defending the fleet, of course. And they also ended up operating from land bases adjacent to that. And the nature of this usage of acting as an interceptor to shoot down bombers that were trying to attack a fleet, this impacted their pilots' tactical preferences because, of course, just hit and running on bombers as opposed to getting sucked into protracted dogfights with enemy fighters where you're not really accomplishing what you need to do, which is protect the fleet. So yeah, I really wanted to point that out specifically because I think Eugen's thread was great and he's a good guy. So.
Awesome. Pure Blue Sky, absolutely follow Eugen and Justin as well. And hey, I'm on there as well. But now we've talked about the Navy and the Army. From what I gather, the Army is a lot more sort of old school in their tactics and the way they want to engage. And also when you look at sort of their aircraft development until later in the sort of
43 to 45 period when sort of new planes are coming out. But it looks very much like they have this turn and burning ingrained in them, and they don't want to let go. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, like the Japanese Army Air Service, it's much more stereotypical, as I would say. And actually, one amusing way you can see that reflected is in your video where you talked about their assessment of the BF-109, where they were doing comparative flight trials and everything, and they were kind of baffled by this German pilot that wasn't dogfighting properly.
Why is he not doing what he's supposed to do? Yes.
And so the Japanese Army, they would shift their tactics over time, but it was into the wider Asia Pacific War when they started getting newer, heavier fighters that they started to make this shift. And this is really reflected as well in the fact that the main fighter that they end up getting, the Ki-43-1, it's an absolutely stupendous, low-speed, traditional dogfighter. It's easily the best monoplane traditional dogfighter of the Second World War, which really is damning it with faint praise, in my opinion, because it's not exactly what they really needed, but it's what they got. And descriptions of Japanese fighter tactics engaging the Chinese, it emphasizes a lot more turning. This is implied as well because when you look at the response of the Japanese Army Air Service to the aerial battles over Nomonhan against the Soviets in 1939, they faced a lot of Soviet hit and run tactics, a far higher frequency than they did in China, and they were kind of taken aback by it.
But they didn't sort of absorb anything from that?
They absorbed maybe a little bit, but of course and this goes for a lot of things when it comes to Nomonhan, is the Japanese tended to do just well enough in a lot of areas that they could get away with not really sitting down and coming to terms with their failures. And I think that's what's so insidious about Nomonhan, because when it's summarized briefly, it's like, oh, well, the Japanese get crushed, which on the surface is true, but they're inflicting a lot of losses, and particularly in the air, they're holding their own. They're more than holding their own for large parts of the campaign, and it means that they don't necessarily pick up on problems like that because they can go, well, it was because we didn't have enough aircraft, that kind of thing. Yeah.
It's very easy then to sort of explain away the shortcomings if you are doing just well enough, like you said, to assume that you would be doing well if you just had a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that. Yeah. But this army preference then with turn and burning would stay 41, 42. I mean, they're obviously engaged on a completely different front than the Navy. Where would you say the first sort of cracks start to appear?
I mean, the first cracks are pretty early because, of course, there's an experimental Ki-44 unit. For people who don't know Japanese aircraft very well, Ki-44 was a much heavier, far more traditional, in my opinion, a far better fighter than the Ki-43 that was their mainstay in that part of the war, where that unit was forced to learn how to do, I guess you could say, modern energy fighting and maneuvering in the vertical, because that aircraft couldn't just turn horizontally everything it faced. But it would take longer. Like it's kind of a loose transitory period, like through 42. Particularly, I think the tipping point is probably 43, because you're starting to see a lot more aircraft like the Ki-61 starting to make an appearance. There's more Ki-44s on the scene. The Japanese army is getting a lot more experience dealing with energy fighting from the Western Allies as well. They're still using a lot of Ki-43s, though, pretty much all the way through the war. So there was still that turn fighting tendency. Although if you see how the Ki-43 itself develops, how they're doing new variants of it, they are adding more and more weight to it. It's starting to lose a little bit of its identity that the Ki-43-1 had when it initially entered service, showing that they are at least acknowledging reality, that they need to start moving away from just keeping your aircraft as absolutely light as possible so that it can have comical stall speeds. And one anecdote I have on the Ki-43 is like an American pilot was observing it, and it's like you're just watching this thing at really low speed just do 2 Immelmans in a row and not stall, and you're like, and he's like, wow, that's amazing, but it can't come close to me.
It looks pretty, but it's just like, it's not a fighter, at least not of this generation. But I mean, if you sort of say that it's like 43, sort of this shift in changing aircraft designs start to appear on the front lines, doesn't that mean that the cracks started to appear and it started to absorb something already around 40? Because that's when you have to, it takes about 3 to 5 years, maybe 3 years on a war footing to develop a new aircraft. where does, for example, the Ki-61 come in as sort of a more traditional Western type fighter?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's because the Japanese. So even though the Japanese army in China is drawing kind of whatever they want from their experience in China, they're also not blind to what is happening in Europe and trends in fighter design in Europe. And part of the impetus for acquiring a 109 and then trialing things like the Ki-27, their far older aircraft against it, was in preparation for the Southern advance against the Western Allies. They were concerned that their older turn fighters were not going to be at all competitive against newer, heavier Western aircraft. And they were kind of pulling in some of those trends from Europe, like, hey, we want a heavy fighter, which in kind of Japanese army design parlance is basically just a single engine fighter that's slightly heavier than weighing like a feather.
Okay. Something lost in translation there, but yeah.
So you have like the Ki-60, which ends up failing, but that leads to the Ki-61, which is similar in many ways. So yeah, like you are correct in pointing out that, like, obviously in terms of design, they were trending away, even if the attitudes of pilots took a little longer once they actually got the planes in their heads and they finished complaining about how it wasn't the same as what they'd flown before.
Which, mind you, is something that every country had. I mean, if you look at some of the comments that pilots had, especially sort of the typical fighter jocks, about adding armor to their aircraft, like the American pilots, British pilots, German pilots. Like, why would we want to put this armor plate in our aircraft that is like 100 pounds is going to make my aircraft more sluggish? And then they come back and that plate saved their life, and they're like, more of that, please. It does take a while for these things to sort of, these self-evident things really to become self-evident, which is bizarre, but that's just how it is, I guess. Now, because we've talked about the Ki-61, and I know there's sort of this take that this is just a flat-out copy of what the Germans had, the British had, and so on. And I did say early on, probably, and not the best way of actually saying this, a Western-type fighter. There's no such a thing as a Western-type fighter, but the Ki-61, to just have a brief history, maybe we can expand on that in a follow-up video. Is that really sort of absorbing just from the West, creating a new plane by themselves, which is sort of the normal development cycle that you could think of, getting influence from somewhere and then creating your own thing? Or where the design specifications literally, well, you've seen a 109, you've seen a Spitfire, create the same thing?
Yeah, it's very much the former. So the head designer for the Ki-61 was actually trained by a German. So when he was given the Ki-61 had a licensed produced version of the DB601 engine.
Yeah.
And he's like, he was trained by a German guy, and he's like, hey, well, I'll design a plane. And then when he designs the plane, it ends up looking European, even though he wasn't copying anything. He was just designing a plane around a German engine in origin that with particular flight characteristics, and you get a plane that probably, if you were going to like finger any particular aesthetic, it's probably closest to like an Italian fighter.
Yeah, MC-202 or something like that.
Yeah, like it's in that kind of area.
Yeah.
Again, not a copy, but just, it's just interesting seeing how smart people around the world, confronted with similar problems, you give them a similar set of tools and they'll come up with planes that look broadly similar.
I mean, that's definitely something we can look into a bit more in the future, especially as Japanese aviation is always derided as being sort of a carbon copy of Western aviation.
So as an addition here, I think it's quite important from what you actually said earlier when we incorporated Eugen's feedback. You said what's on paper and what happens in reality is very different. Now, from the European perspective and the European air war, I can absolutely underline that as well. You don't always get to fight the way you want to or you prefer to, right? And I think nowadays, especially sort of as a lot of us play simulators and so on and know a lot about the technical intricacies of the aircraft, it's easy to say, well, with this aircraft, you always have to do this. And that's also why those pilots back then did that all the time. And in order to counter this aircraft, you have to do X, Y, and Z. We know a lot about that nowadays. But once you're actually in a combat situation, things look quite different. So just you said that you definitely wanted to add something there as well.
Yeah. So it was kind of like, I think it was unspoken between us while we were going over preferences that sometimes you just don't get to fight the way you want to. But I think it's worth emphasizing. For example, the reason why there's so many accounts from pilots and the historiography where the Allies were struggling with the low speed maneuverability of Japanese fighters, like the early part of the war, like particularly 41, 42, was because many Allied pilots were still getting drawn into dogfights. Either by choice, they were seeking them out because they maybe didn't have the full understanding of the relative capabilities of their aircraft versus the Japanese fighters, or in many other cases, it was because they simply lacked the energy to escape. You can't always dive out of trouble. You can't always run away. Just depending on the tactical circumstances you find yourself in, you might just have to cope with what the hand you were dealt. This is particularly true given things like the speed of the A6M2 was often close to or higher than that of many Allied aircraft in kind of that early part of the war, 41, 42, for what they were fighting. And this would kind of basically hold true until the next generation of Allied aircraft started to show up through 43 into 44. So, for example, like the P-39 and P-40, both of them had higher maximum speeds on paper, but this was only really at lower altitudes. And they were often, due to the context of the early campaigns, they were often pressed into fights against A6M2s at higher altitudes where they didn't really have that advantage. And they were also, unfortunately for them, forced to try to intercept Japanese bomber formations. So now you're trying to climb quickly in a P-39 to high altitude, which is like the two things you don't ever want to be doing in a P-39.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the reason why it gets viewed the way it does.
If you want more information on that, do check out our, didn't we have a conversation years ago about the P-49 that's already in the channel? Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of context is shown as well on why the P-49 was so derided by American pilots. And it all has to do, or much of it has to do basically with the fights they have to fight rather than with the aircraft in itself.
Just as a quick note, for the F4F retained good performance at higher altitudes, and that is one reason why it was able to hold its own against the A6M2 and did so generally better than the Army aircraft of the same period. The F4F for many decades was kind of maligned, and I'm not going to say it's a recent shift, but probably since at least the 80s, I feel that there's been a course correction and people have kind of given the F4F, I think, a bit more of its due. I'm also an F4F apologist. I love that plane. But
hey, it's a good plane. I love it as well.
I have a model of it back there, actually.
Yeah, no. Every time I get access to a museum that has one, I just beeline towards the one. It's amazing.
And yeah, so one day, as a teaser, we will do a big video on technological determinism in the Asia-Pacific Air War, where we're going to deep dive into the importance of context beyond just comparing aircraft technical characteristics, and I think it's going to be pretty eye-opening for a lot of people. I'm excited about that one.
I mean, if we do that, we may as well just do the whole war, because I'll do the European theater, you'll do Pacific, and I think we'll see the exact same trends in a way. Path dependency, technological determinism, and why some choices that appear very rational turn out in the end to be, biting you back, or actually having been the only real decision that you could take, but in the grand scheme of things, it led you down the wrong path. But yeah, thanks, Justin, and back to the original video.
If anybody in the comments now, if anybody of the viewers wants to post a comment, have some questions, maybe even push back on things, always happy to look at those things, and Justin is as well. Please also cite your sources if you have them handy. Right, Japanese bomber tactics and formations. Now, this is going to be very different to most likely the Japanese fighters. But if we sort of look at China and then the operations in the late 1930s there, and then the start, of course, of World War II for Japan and also the US, we tend to think of the Pacific and the South Pacific for World War II with Japanese fight tactics mainly, because the Zero is sort of that archetype adversary there. But a lot of the Japanese tactics when it comes to bombers must have already developed, just like we had on the fighter episode, in China, where they were waiting for about 4 years before Pearl Harbor. Could you give sort of a picture overview of the operations there?
Yeah, so Japanese bombing raids at the outset of the war were, in summary, really small and mostly ineffective. So it was reflecting a lack of experience or training in attacking land targets, particularly on the part of the Japanese Navy Air Service. When you look at their early operations, there are multiple raids they're conducting against Chinese airfields in 37 that are occurring at exceptionally low level, like 350 to 450 meters. That's like, like 1,100 to 1,400 feet ish. The attacks appeared so absurd that one American intelligence report that had observed some of these concluded that Japanese, quote, horizontal bombing at ridiculously low altitudes was not in the nature of aerial warfare at all, was rather the aerial transport of high explosives, end quote. So the losses in these early unescorted low-level attacks were high. The Japanese Navy's first combined air group lost half of its land-based attack aircraft, so its twin-engine bombers, in 3 days of operations, leading to the group's detailed after-action report to compare the bomber losses to the extremely bloody Battle of 203 Meter Hill during the Russo-Japanese War.
And how many aircraft are we talking about here, if it's half of them?
So typically the early raids, they consisted of maybe 9 to at most 18 aircraft, so 1 or 2 Chutai. The small scale of these raids were due in part to a belief that small numbers of bombers could be decisive, which, as you've noted, I mean, it technically could be. Like if you could hit your target, sure, but of course hitting your targets is not a simple thing. And as a byproduct of this assumption, the Japanese Navy bomber crews, they were not trained to fly in large formations, and they had difficulty holding such formations in combat. This was made worse as losses mounted, and then different formations were kind of smashed together from the survivors, and then there was a predictable loss of unit cohesion. And American observers would consistently note that Japanese bombers, they tended to break formation and bomb individually. So Claire Chennault, who was an American advisor to the Chinese at the time, he observed Japanese bombing raids against Nanjing in 1937, and he stated that, quote, Japanese bombers use very poor tactics, come over in small units, ragged formation, end quote. Another intelligence report from January 1938 on Japanese bombing in southern China, it emphasized that, quote, formations are usually scattered. Upon arrival over objective, the formation, such as it is, breaks up completely, and bombing is done individually, and the individually is actually underlined. There has been no pattern bombing, end quote. And to add to that, when they're observing is when they're talking about no pattern bombing or bombing being done individually, it's not even just that the aircraft break up and then just drop their bombs somewhere and leave. You would see at times, quite commonly, one bomber would go over their target, drop one bomb, circle back around, come back, drop their second bomb, come back around.
Wow. Okay.
And of course, you can do that when there are no fighters around. There's barely any fighter opposition. But of course, that is just not going to. Yeah, it's not going to work against opponents that have significant air opposition, which they'd already run into in China too, in other areas. Yeah. But of course, this is showing like a lack of experience on the part of the Japanese bomber crews and the sophistication of a lack of sophistication in Japanese bomber tactics in this early stage of the war in like 37, early 38.
I mean, the interesting bit is here, of course, that initially this is something that basically every country learns, is that when you use bombers, you bomb en masse. You have one lead bomber there. You maybe have one bomber that takes over if the lead bomber gets shot down or falls behind due to damage. And then you drop en masse as the leader drops its bombs, right? This is something that the Germans learned. This is something that the British learned. Who also did a lot of like individual bombing, especially at night, but that's another story. And of course, that's also something that the US had to learn. But this idea that you could drop one single bomb at a time, is this just to improve accuracy? Is this did this even have an effect on the ground? Because I can assume that if there's no opposition of any kind, neither fighter interceptors or ground defenses, that this could theoretically be quite effective. But is there any sort of report on this?
Yeah, like as far as the effects of some of this early bombing, a lot of it is not particularly effective because they just don't have you were talking about interwar twin engine bombers, right? Like they're carrying upwards of, for the Japanese, like at most 800 kilograms worth of bombs, usually mostly 60 kilogram bombs for the Navy if they're carrying multiple or 50 kilogram bombs of their army. As far as this individual bombing goes, like at least as far as the American observer, the Western observers that I've read are concerned, they're not really impressed by it really at all. I've seen a handful of reports that, but they're usually from later on, where they're talking about, for example, they're quite impressed with the performance of the 60 kilogram bombs of all things, at least as far as hitting light targets. But as far as this early accuracy and things like, there's a lot of contempt for, and this is where things get a little particular, because remember that these American observers are stewing in their own thoughts on how bombers are supposed to work in the late 1930s, and quite frankly, they haven't done it themselves yet. So some of their criticism is perhaps just, it's stemming from their own over optimistic assumptions. I'm like, well, if you give us 5 bombers, we'll go in and we'll put it down, so as long as you filter that out.
Well, we've seen them try this. We see them try this in the early Pacific as well, and not really, and really coming to the same conclusion that small pockets of bombers aren't really that effective at all. So fast forwarding a couple of months now, and we're going to be returning to this question since Justin was able to find some additional information to talk about sort of this tendency, or these reports that the Japanese were dropping single bombs. And Justin, what have you found?
Yeah, I wanted to look into it because originally behind the scenes, you kind of sprang the question on me. I didn't have a good answer at that moment. So in China, the Western allies were very critical of it. I think for good reason. It wasn't particularly effective in that context, but I wanted to look around and see like what ended up happening to it. And one big example I found was actually during the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya on December 10th, 1941. The first Chutai that contained 8 G3Ms from Mihodo Kokutai, they opted to do this single bombing as a formation. So they combined the lead bombardier system with the single bombing. So each plane in the formation carried 250 kilogram bombs, and they dropped only one on the first attack using the lead bombardier system as a formation. The bombing in this case was extremely accurate, and in the first drop, they did score a hit and several near misses. Then the formation, which had actually sustained quite a bit of anti-aircraft fire, 2 of them had to retire, but there were still 6 left in the formation that each had one more 250 kilogram bomb left. They loitered out of AA range, waiting for like another opportunity to reattack the target. They came back in, and that time Repulse was able to avoid that second drop. But I thought that was very interesting to see that that individual bombing practice being used against shipping targets, and effectively, because they do score a hit. Now, there might be other cases out there where it maybe occurred again in the wider Asia-Pacific War. I wasn't able to find another specific example. And this theory crafting a little bit here, but many of the future horizontal bombing attacks that were against larger ship targets, the Japanese bombers were under significant pressure from defensive fighter cover, which I think would probably explain why they would just opt to go in and dump everything they have and try to get out, instead of, trying to loiter back and come back for more while you're getting savaged by fighters. I guess it's worth noting as well, the other G3M formations that were involved in the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, they were only carrying one 500 kilogram bomb. So they only had a single drop. They also used the lead bombardier system as well. One case of that system failing also happened during that action. This isn't unique to the Japanese. It's just a weakness of the lead bombardier system. But basically, the lead bombardier in one of the formations hit the button accidentally, and the whole formation dropped. And from the British perspective, they thought it was actually like the bombs were so far off target, they thought a bomber had been damaged and had jettisoned their bomb load. But no, somebody just hit the wrong button. I guess, like, as another note for that, if people are wondering, well, 500 kilograms is pretty light. It was pretty light. They actually could carry up to 800, but apparently the armor-piercing 800 kilogram bombs, they had so few of them in the Navy because they'd kind of been specially made. They'd all been allocated to the attack on Pearl Harbor. caused they had to opt for lighter bombs in that attack.
Ever since my second conversation with Justin Pyke on this, I randomly went through some files from the Battle of Poland on the Luftwaffe side and actually ran into a similar case. And that comes from Luftwaffe 1, where a couple of bombers were attacking a Polish radio tower. Now, I don't know if these are Heinkel 111s or Dornier 17s. The file doesn't really say. It's too high in the chain of command to really worry about those details. But what they say is that because radio towers are incredibly difficult to take out from the sky with bombers, they once sent 2 Bomberstaffeln, so that's up to 18 aircraft, likely somewhat lower. And these bombers had to conduct single runs from 1,800 meters to attack this radio tower, and were eventually successful in destroying it. Now, sadly, the German translation of single runs is a bit awkward because it doesn't actually say in the original file either, or it doesn't make this really clear. Is this single bombers making 4 single runs, or is this the Staffeln breaking down into individual Ketten? So let's say 3 aircraft, or perhaps a larger Kette with 5 aircraft or something like that, and then making single runs based on that on the radio tower. In any case, these more deliberate attacks, let's say, appear to be more accurate, especially against such a difficult target. However, of course, that also requires you to have all the time in the world to not be worried about enemy defenses, especially at 1,800 meters. You can still be relatively engaged by light AA and definitely by medium AA, and there is no enemy fighters about. And you're not too worried about, recycling sortie rates, because actually that takes a lot of time to have individual Ketten launch an attack and then reforming the formation and so on. So yeah, it's a bit complicated, and it's really something that I have seen for the first time with the Luftwaffe. So interesting there to run into this recently, and I thought I'd put it in here. And now back to the main episode.
Setting that stuff aside, for the most part, like these early Japanese operations are clearly struggling, and you can see that just because they're not proving absolutely devastating to the Chinese. They're not knocking out large Chinese factories. They're not devastating all Chinese airfields that they hit. They're struggling clearly, and this also reflects in the Japanese response to these early operations as well.
So I do wonder here at this point as though, is this inexperience? Is this unfamiliarity with land-based targets? Whereas if they hit, or if they do their practice runs against maritime targets, they're actually doing better, or much of this is just transposed from the maritime tactics over to land targets? Or is this just a blatant sort of the typical 1930s, the bomber will always come through sort of mentality that never mind what you do, a couple of bombs will fix the problem?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, really. Particularly when you talk about the Navy, because the vast majority of their training pre-China is focused on maritime issues, maritime patrol, attacking accurately against maneuvering ship targets, torpedo warfare. Are starting to enter the picture for the land-based units. Like the G3M is still very new, and that's like one of basically the first bomber that they have on the land-based units that can do it. So that was their focus going into this war. So one example I can think of is like weapon target pairings are a little weird sometimes when it comes to the Navy, because they obviously had a preference going in doctrinally for we're going to carry a very small number of larger bombs, which against shipping targets, of course, is what you need to do. But it takes them a little while to start figuring out that maybe we need to actually pepper an area with a variety of different smaller bombs. They start mixing bomb loads. So you can see images of G3Ms in China that are flying out with maybe one 250 kilogram bomb and then some 60 kilogram bombs on top of that. So there's lots of little adaptations like that of this air service trying to feel out, hey, how do we, in the words of the late great historian Mark Peaty, how do we attack a continent instead of ships?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I mean, with Japan, or especially the Navy having a very sort of maritime Pacific outlook, attacking land targets is drastically different. And that is also something that not just Japan or not just in the Japanese Navy discovered. But as we look sort of at this adaptation, so okay, they're figuring out a little bit of what is the bomb load, what is the concentration of bombs they want to put in any sort of square mile and postcode. What are some other changes that they're doing? So you said that they're attacking from very low altitudes. Again, this is something that a lot of countries did at the start of the war. But then very rapidly they increase the altitudes, and that also causes then a drop in accuracy most of the time. Is that the same thing? Is that the same thing happening with the Japanese Navy?
Yeah, exactly the same pattern. So you start to see that bombing raids, they begin to occur from typically between 3,000 meters, that's almost 10,000 feet. And then there could, even in cases where they were anticipating heavy opposition, altitudes could exceed 7,000 meters, that's like 23,000 feet, with use of oxygen. Which was something that they had to, of course, feel out as well, just to keep bomber losses reasonable. But of course, when you're bombing from that high up, it means that there's a drop in accuracy as well. Formation discipline also improved it like almost immeasurably. So the formation tactics evolved both for defense against fighters and for pattern bombing. So when defending against fighters, Japanese Navy bomber formations, they would collapse from kind of a V of V's into a very tight, pseudo line abreast to maximize defensive firepower. Now, of course, you can get into all sorts of discussions that, well, there's, the American combat box and everything like that. So I'm not necessarily going to say definitively, oh, this was the way to do it or anything, but it shows that like they are improving, they're proving their defensive formations compared to the formation barely exists and then it breaks up over the target.
Well, the combat box also had to operate in a completely different environment than 1930s China, where fighter planes are probably not necessarily being vectored by radar, not coming from different directions, and also the performance of those fighters vis-a-vis the bombers are very different. And also the angles, the firing angles from the bombers are also going to be different. So they probably figured out a relatively good way of defending their bombers by trial and error.
Yeah. And then in 1940-41, I don't have an exact date here. There was a new system of formation bombing introduced. So all bombers in a formation dropped their bombs simultaneously when instructed by a lead bombardier. These lead bombardiers, they were selected based on skill rather than seniority, and then they were put through an extensive training program. Of course, this is very similar to what other air forces adopted, including the U.S. Army Air Force later on. Now, the number of bombers involved in individual raids also increased dramatically. After a major Japanese Army bomber operation that had occurred in kind of late 38, early 39, the Japanese found that if they only had like a handful of aircraft in their heavy bomber regiments that they were using in an attack, that it really gave the enemy a lot of chance to attack them, because in the air they were just losing communication and cooperation was very often lost. And one of the results of this is that we need to dramatically increase the size of our raids. In 1939, the number of Japanese Navy Air Service bombers conducting raids in the Chinese interior was between 18 and 36. So you're seeing like a little bit of increase from 37. By summer of 1940, the figures increased to between 50 and 90 per raid.
Okay.
Wow. And there could be raids that were potentially even larger than that. And this was also reflected in Japanese Navy Air Service organizations. So the air groups would give away to combined air groups, and then they start to envision air fleets to carry out these large scale operations. And then, by the onset of the spring 1940, the first of two major joint Japanese Navy and Army strategic bombing efforts, like the scale and level of coordination for those raids bore no resemblance to what had come before. Like these were fundamentally just different air organizations, perhaps unsurprisingly for people that are familiar with the evolution of the CBO in Europe. And this could be noted as well by reading what foreign observers were seeing. So it's not even like something that we only know in hindsight. This was so readily apparent that even at the time, people on the ground, like Americans, Brits, whoever, observing these operations were noticing that again, like in a 1940 intelligence report, Chinese aviators that they were talking to, they described Japanese Navy bomber formation discipline as excellent. Their level bombing is good and continuously improving. And they also just kept noting the consistent use of large formations. Another American report, this time from 41, they noted that quote, Japanese tactics have been modified considerably since 1937, end quote. And then they went on to detail, again, the increased size and discipline of bombing formations, the use of reconnaissance aircraft to check weather and assess targets, bombing from higher altitudes, and two other features of note we'll discuss perhaps in a future video is the widespread use of fighter escort for the bombers and fighter sweeps preceding the raids. Now, one kind of interesting irony of all of this is that while they were improving in their ability to attack land targets, specifically for the Japanese Navy land-based bombers, they weren't practicing their maritime duties. So what ended up happening is they actually had to be pulled up in the autumn of 1941. They were pulled out of China so that they could start working up for the move south. They had to basically retrain on attacking maritime targets, doing maritime patrol, navigation over water, all those things that they would need to start doing their original role again of closely cooperating with the surface fleet. Now, given the performance of their maritime duties throughout the early offensives, this pre-war workup was successful, but it necessitated the withdrawal of the Japanese Navy Air Service from China to do it for a few months before the war. Now, the experience in China of attacking land targets, particularly airfields, that did become very useful in the outset of the Asia-Pacific War.
I mean, I do have a question there. I mean, if the Navy has to pull out of China in order to sort of recoup and refamiliarize themselves with their primary the skill set that they required and for their upcoming plans in the Pacific and the South Pacific, starting in late 1941, I don't want to stir sort of this competition between the Army and the Navy here that Japan was famous for, but where was the Army in this case? Like, were they also conducting similar things that you were sort of talking about? Was this a similar development within the Army, or was this just Navy? And
the Army was developing along similar lines. Now, there's certain caveats here in that I am limited by our source base because, unfortunately, when it comes to the Japanese Army Air Service, there is very little writing in English on the Japanese Army Air Service that is actually studying it in any detail as an institution. Particularly before the war. There's like a little bit you can find during the war itself, but from what I could observe through looking at through the Japanese monographs, American intelligence reports, all that, they're learning similar lessons. They're coming to grips with similar things. Their use of air power, of course, is quite different from the Navy because they don't have the maritime duties. Their primary theater in their minds is in Manchuria, facing the Soviets. That influences their aircraft design, that influences how they are envisioning what they'll do with their air power. And the China war, for the most part, just kind of feeds into what they were already incrementally improving on because they're already operating over land, hitting land targets, trying to knock out enemy aviation, interdiction, close air support, those kinds of things. So there's definitely improvement, development on the Army side as well. Their main issue once they start getting dragged into specifically the South Pacific Air War is that you're telling all these Army boys who were trained to fly over the steppes to start doing long range missions entirely over open ocean. And really there's a really rough transition period that I don't think the Japanese Army Air Service, certainly in through the mid part of the war, ever really fully comes to grips with. They're really struggling to make their air power work in the South Pacific because it was just not what they planned to do.
I mean, if we look sort of at the outlook, going back to the Navy here, we have the Navy, that's a maritime strike force that involves automatically discussions about range and delivering that firepower at range. And then they're operating on the continent or like in China, and that's very different, of course, as you already said. But how did this sort of expectation and also the designs that the aircraft had with range and the operational realities then coalesce in the Pacific? And how did that work out?
Yeah, so what I would argue is that their early experience in China, one of the biggest wins that they got out of it was learning how to conduct operations at extreme ranges, because that was a capability that the Japanese Navy and Army Air Services would have to use pretty much constantly from all the way until the surrender. So in the words of the historian Osamu Tagaya, quote, "In matters of distance, the air war in Asia was a different order of magnitude from the one in Europe," end quote. And it's really no exaggeration. The ranges that the Japanese have to conduct this air war at are astonishing. Even in the earliest days of the war in China, G3Ms, so Navy bombers, they made unprecedented round trips of up to 1,850 kilometers. So that's like over 1,100 miles, most of it over the East China Sea, to launch strikes against Hangzhou, Shanghai, and Nanjing from their bases on Taiwan and Kyushu. These have often been described as the first transoceanic bombing campaign in history, which I guess would depend on how you define things like the Taiwan Strait and East China Sea. And then there was also, they were the Germans were bombing people over the Channel and stuff in the First World War even. But it's still an impressive feat nonetheless. To put things in kind of relative scale with Europe, I mean, the Japanese Navy was conducting air operations at distance that were longer than that from London to Berlin by 1941, like clockwork. On occasion in 1941, for example, there was a flight of A6Ms that flew information nonstop entirely at night, further than the average distance from British airfields to Hamburg, to conduct a fighter sweep against Chengdu in the early morning. And they did it they had one G4M, so a bomber, that tagged along with them for navigation reasons. And they conducted this ridiculously long-range fighter sweep, no problems, no losses. The ability to conduct such operations out to these extreme ranges was an outstanding achievement in the late 1930s and into 41, and I think it's understated by most historians. To really stress this point, the war in China gave the Japanese air services lots of real-world experience in dealing with the challenges that come with conducting long-range operations. So people who know a lot about the combined bomber offensive in Europe are probably familiar with many of them. How do you group up these large formations of bombers and then fly information for hours, navigating to the targets that are hundreds of kilometers away, coordinating with the fighter escort throughout all of this, coordinating with fighter sweeps and reconnaissance and weather reports. It's not a simple set of problems to solve, and the Japanese had to come to grips with them like other air forces would in their own longer range campaigns later on.
And how did they apply then this Chinese or the China experience to World War II?
Yeah, so they used it right from the outset of the war. I mean, the Japanese, particularly the Navy, took the valuable experience and applied it right into that conflict. The speed and scope of the initial offensives was only made possible by the ability of Japanese air power to hit out hard to long ranges. And this is, and I will emphasize this is not just on a technical level of, they designed planes that can go that far. It's Japanese air power as an offensive system being able to reach out to extreme range and reduce Allied air power, hit their ships, interdict, do all of these mission roles out to these ranges that were very impressive. And while I'd argue that, that all of this is quite striking and impressive, at times it could serve as a crutch, I think. And you start to see this later on after the initial momentum of the early offensives has kind of worn off, is that they start to go, well, just because we can launch these missions at extreme range, it kind of means that we're just going to start doing it constantly. And I mean, the most extreme example of that is, of course, once the Americans land on Guadalcanal in 42, the Japanese Navy is forced to sustain these major air operations involving bombing raids and anti-shipping attacks and fighter sweeps against Guadalcanal and the surrounding area from its airfields around Rabaul in New Britain. And that distance involved, it's over 1,000 kilometers. It's like almost 650 miles one way. So again, for comparison, Berlin's roughly 740 kilometers, 460 miles from air bases in eastern Britain, roughly. It's an astonishing achievement, but also that's a really long way to try and sustain an air campaign.
I mean, that's what I was just going to say, because you can see it as an achievement, and you can really say, okay, so this is something that the Japanese do very, very well, and operating at range, of course, for air power is extremely important, and doing it well is even better. But aren't there sort of problems associated with this sort of operation at range? And do you create, especially now thinking about the South Pacific and the whole basic problem, do you not create sort of a dependency on range that if you were to have a little bit less range in your aircraft, maybe you would think more about how do you base the aircraft? Where would you build your airfields? And do you actually need to put a little bit more emphasis on that?
Yeah, exactly. Is that they decided to fight this extended campaign at these extreme ranges, and these ranges were so astonishing that when they initially they had pulled out the maps at Rabaul once there was landings on Guadalcanal, and they're showing the Zero pilots like, hey, we're going to send you here and fight this campaign. Even the Zero pilots were like, excuse me. And of course, like, it's the similar problems that you'll see for any Air Force that are operating out at like the very limits of what they can sustain as far as range goes. So they were forced to fight with their drop tanks attached rather than jettisoning them, because they needed to suck every last drop of fuel out of them to try keep themselves in the air. Even without dropping them, they had roughly a 15-minute fight time over Guadalcanal before their fuel situation forced them to return back to Rabaul. The A6M3, so a newer, improved version of the Zero that started to enter service around this time, it couldn't even reach Guadalcanal from Rabaul, which limited the number of fighters that could make the trip. And then those fighters themselves were older models until closer airfields were established. The strike missions, they lasted 8 hours or more, which of course was physically and mentally exhausting for the air crews involved. And the extreme range also made Japanese strikes predictable. Which was an issue with some long-range missions in China as well. But I mean, if you want to fly an 8-hour plus long mission and you don't want to risk returning after dark, you have very limited options. You know, you get ready to depart at daybreak, you fly the mission, you get back before dark. The Americans are going to know, and they did, roughly when strikes were going to show up. And of course, that was helped by their early warning, but they would always know within, about an hour or two when they could expect attacks. And then, of course, if you sustain battle damage, you have to worry now about nursing your damaged plane or your injured self back like over 1,000 kilometers, a bit closer if you happen to limp to the underdeveloped grass strip at Buka. And then, of course, later on in the campaign, they would establish a much better airfield at Buin. For a lot of this campaign, like, you're kind of just left out there, and there's a lot of Japanese aircrew who just end up dying because they can't make it back to a safe area to land. It's in large part this mission was forced on the Japanese Navy Air Service by itself, because they had neglected airfield construction and defense before the war. And it took them a long time to build up forward airfields for the most part. Ironically, Henderson Field actually developed pretty quickly because they were quite lavishly equipped by Japanese standards as far as construction equipment went, and then the Americans grabbed it from them right when it was done. But just generally outside of that, like, it took them a while to do it. And the accommodating conditions of the air war in China had done little to encourage improvement in this area, nor had the opening campaigns, because for the most part, they could grab developed Allied airfields in their initial attacks and just use those and then leapfrog to the next one. And as soon as that was no longer an option, then they needed to start developing their own bases. They did so quite slowly. One astonishing thing that I read about is for the Japanese Navy, their construction units that they were using to build all these airfields and everything, I'd always just assumed that they'd been around for years and years before the war. They were established as they existed during the operational planning for the move south. Like, it was combined fleet going, hey, we're going to be capturing all this territory and we need to establish construction units that can build airfields. They hadn't envisioned it. And the basic reason for that is that Yamamoto was thinking so far outside the box that the Japanese Navy hadn't designed itself to fight the kind of war that he was forcing upon it, operationally speaking. It was far more aggressive and expansive than what pre-war Japanese Navy thinking for 2 decades had envisioned. Because normally they'd be like, well, we'd be defending our own colonies and everything. We would just build up our airfields there on friendly ground and work off that. And then the Americans would come to us and we'd deal with them. But when you're stretching out all the way across the Pacific and you're constantly on the attack, you need to be able to build up air bases yourself quickly on the front line, which is something that the Japanese they just didn't have the resources to do properly.
I mean, this opens up a whole new sort of idea that we could maybe talk about in the future, sort of the systemic problems that they have. Because from what I gather in this video, again, it's similar to the fighter episode that we have, that is probably already out now for viewers to watch as well.
is that tactically the Japanese are able to sort of compete with the Allies for a considerable amount of time, but there are sort of these underlying operational and then sort of strategic issues that they have that are being hidden behind sort of this tactical ability to still wrestle with the adversary for some time. So definitely something for us to look into in the future. And if you have any questions on that, please put them in the comments below. So I think this one follows up really neatly on the first couple of episodes that we had, namely on Japanese fighter tactics and then bomber tactics, because now I want to talk with you about the escorts for the bombers, because this is, again, something that we very much associate with the combined bomber offensive, the European theater, these fighter sweeps starting basically with the Battle of Britain and then going, of course, into their full-on mass employment of pursuit aircraft by the Americans during World War II in the bomber offensive. But we are looking at the Japanese. So this idea of accompanying bombers with fighters, is this something that comes out of the experience that they have in China, where the bomber will always come through hits a hard wall of reality, or is this something that organically sort of appeared out of the operations?
Yeah, it's directly a result of combat experience in China. So initially, bombing raids, they were conducted without fighter escort, and the high losses forced the Japanese to adapt because they just couldn't sustain them otherwise. So Chenault, kind of in a bit of hyperbole, not unfounded for him. So he proclaims in his memoir, after high losses of Japanese bombers over Nanjing in 1937, that it was the end of unescorted daylight bombing in China. That wasn't strictly true. However, unescorted bombing missions continued due to range limitations on Japanese fighters. This was particularly true when the Japanese air services began to launch bombing raids against targets deep in the Chinese interior, such as Chongqing, the eventual wartime capital after the fall of Wuhan, and Lanzhou. And the Japanese, they weren't ignoring these bomber losses on the unescorted missions. So, for example, there was a lot of fierce air combat over Hanguo in central China after 36 unescorted G3Ms were hit hard by Soviet pilots. The Japanese actually suspended air operations until fighters were in range to escort them. And then over time, you can see that the importance that the Japanese would place on fighter escort was actually influencing operational planning in the land war. They'd be like, hey, we're going to make this attack towards this forward airfield just because we want to base fighters there so that we can escort our bombers deeper into the Chinese hinterland.
Chenault, who was he, just for the uninitiated?
So he was, of course, at this time a advisor for Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, for their air force. And then, of course, he would become much more to prominence later once the United States joined the war. He was involved with, of course, the Flying Tigers, most famously, and various American air efforts in China. He was also the one that one, I guess, interesting detail about Chiang Kai-shek is that he really caught the air power bug real bad. And I think that was in large part because he liked Chenault more than Stilwell. And I can't really blame him personality-wise. But it's kind of an interesting thing. So you'd see, that's why you get some very strange requests from Chiang Kai-shek during the war. He's like, he just wants hundreds of fighters and everything. He's like, it'll fix everything. It wouldn't. And they also didn't have hundreds and hundreds of fighters to teleport into China. But that in part was influence, I think, from Chenault.
I mean, tangentially on this topic, of course, of Japanese fighters and Chenault, and you said the Flying Tigers. Did the Flying Tigers ever fight Zeros?
No. No.
You've heard it here first. Actually, it's already written in history.
Yeah.
They did not fight Zeros. However, why is Chenault always sort of put in linked to the Zero?
So he does observe combat against Zeros and stuff in China, and he's writing just broadly for his time in China. He's writing some of the best intelligence reporting and sending back some of the best information on the Japanese air services before the war back. And he will claim in his post-war memoirs that he's totally ignored and everything like that. It's not quite the case. His stuff is getting places, and it is not totally out of line either with what other observers are saying. So this is a whole other discussion. And one day We'll sit down and we'll talk about interwar intelligence assessments, and I will sit here for 18 hours, and you'll want to kill yourself. but
I'll make a note of it as a future video. I think in literally every video we've already had a conversation, and we have identified maybe one, maybe two more potential topics. But if you have, as a viewer, have more questions and so on, put them in the comments below, and then we may be able to make a full-on video of that as well. But coming back to the matter at hand, Japanese fighter escorts. Looking at the Navy here again, because again, we always have to remind ourselves there's the Navy and the Army Air Service with the Japanese, just like it was for the Americans, for example. What were sort of the main improvements coming out of this sort of period in China where they were operating with very sort of, well, we could say naive, but very sort of 1930s assumption that you see around the globe of air power, of unescorted bombers, and where did that take them?
So beyond just saying, oh, they added fighter escort, which of course is, it takes a lot more effort than that, is of course the improvements in coordination, everything that we've mentioned before. But looking at the tactical level, you can see it very clearly by 42. It is very standardized. Japanese Navy bomber escorts were split into two distinct mission profiles. And this is something that actually I'm curious to ask you about, is how this compares to other air forces like the Luftwaffe. But the Japanese Navy would have a covering force. So this was the basically close escort. They flew above and behind the bombers and provided direct escort against attacks. And then there was an air control force that flew out ahead of the bombers to destroy any climbing interceptors, to go cause trouble in front of the bomber formations. And then there could be fighters placed to the left and right of the bomber formations in close escort as well, if they had the numbers on hand to permit it.
I think this is not a video that we could actually do, then comparing sort of the Japanese, the British, maybe the American, and also the German sort of development of that, because I think we'll, just as a quick answer here, I think we'll see that the development is very similar and comes out of the very similar sort of thinking, and also the same sort of problems that they have with then all sides coming up with this sort of close-in escorts plus fighter sweeps in front of the formation being the best thing if you have the amount of fighters available. But please continue.
Yeah, and as far as, so once they successfully introduced fighter escort, it led to a significant drop in bomber losses over China. So just to compare two major operations, in the spring-summer of 1940, the Operation 101, which is a huge strategic bombing operation, lost and damaged G3Ms, so the Japanese Navy bombers, exceeded a prohibitive figure of about 10% by their own judgment, because they had no fighter escort. It was just too long range. They couldn't provide it. The Zero hadn't entered service yet. The following on Operation 102 in the summer of 41 had significantly lower loss rates, and that was attributed by the Japanese in large part to the introduction of the A6M, the Zero, to provide escort throughout the missions. They viewed that as the absolute key to why loss rates changed so dramatically between those two major operations.
And it's worthwhile to say here that China did have some sort of fighter planes that were providing interceptor duties or interceptor capabilities, whereas their ground defenses in terms of AA weren't that great. Is that correct to say? Especially, I mean, considering that it's the 1930s, I would say that's an accurate assessment.
Yeah, I guess we haven't really discussed much the scale of Chinese opposition. So, like, by the standard of the 1930s, like particularly Chongqing was like reasonably well defended as far as ground defenses go, but absolutely nothing compared to what you'd see later, and certainly like very effective ground-based defenses that you'd see later on. That probably the best thing about the Chinese system that Chenault helped set up was they had an excellent early warning system of like observers and everything like that would help them greatly. And then this is a whole other can of worms, but I'll just mention as well that like the Chinese were getting huge amounts of Soviet assistance, like hundreds of Soviet pilots, mechanics, hundreds and hundreds of modern Soviet aircraft, like absolute first rate for 1930s Soviet aircraft. So this conception that the Japanese were just beating up on this, like, completely defenseless China is not quite the case. Was China still the underdog in the air? Of course. But the Japanese were running into pretty significant Chinese and Soviet resistance throughout this 37 to 41 period. It tailed off after 1940 on the Soviet assistance side, and this is probably the dark years as far as the air war in China is concerned, where Soviet assistance is drying up, Western assistance hasn't really taken off yet, and this is where it's really dark days for the Chinese Air Force, 40-41.
I mean, as always, judging sort of the capabilities of the time, we have to look at it sort of from that lens of the 1930s rather than the lens of 1944 and 1945. You can compare those, but you have to keep them in context and see sort of what their effectiveness was for this period in time, because obviously 1944, 1945, the capabilities there are much better indeed. But going back to the fighter sweeps and the sort of the fighter escorts, what sort of were the main assumptions there, and also the evaluations, for example, that foreign observers had?
So even before the war in China, the Japanese air services placed a strong emphasis on the destruction of enemy air power in their doctrine, both the Army and the Navy, particularly the Army, which actually explicitly laid out a doctrine of aerial exterminating action. And its objective was just, quote, the positive and autonomous surveillance and complete destruction of enemy aircraft in the air and while still on the ground at their airfields, end quote. So then once enemy air opposition had been neutralized, the Japanese Army Air Service would then switch over to close air support of the ground forces. Now, this doctrine survived with some revisions into the Asia-Pacific War. It was revised particularly after Nomonhan and lessons learned there. But for the most part, it functionally was still pretty similar. And Western observers, they noted there was a strong emphasis right from the outset of the war on neutralizing the Chinese Air Force, including priority targeting of airfields, and as well trying to just shoot down Chinese fighters or aircraft anywhere they could be found. This was most evident early on with the Japanese Navy in central China, for the basic fact that they were fighting almost all of the early Chinese air opposition in central China, like around Shanghai, Nanjing. In the north, the Japanese Army Air Service was focused on close air support and interdiction because they were there was like no Chinese aviation in North China at this time at all, and they were largely focusing on just routing Chinese warlord armies in the north in front of the Japanese army advance. Now, fighter sweeps were a central feature of both the Army and Navy Air Service's efforts to neutralize the Chinese Air Force. Of course, the intention of a fighter sweep was to kind of aggressively seek out and destroy enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. Japanese fighters would strafe airfields within their area of operations. They'd confront any enemy air opposition that arose head-on. Now, to supplement these sweeps, the bombers would not only target enemy airfields, but they would also occasionally act as bait to lure interceptors into the air, at which point they would be swarmed by escorts that were waiting in ambush. So one example of this occurred on the 3rd of October, 1937, when 9 carrier-based dive bombers were sent on a raid against Nanjing, and they had the express purpose as acting as bait because there were 27 fighters, so an entire tie, waiting to spring the trap on any Chinese fighters that were unfortunate enough to intercept. Fighter sweeps and the targeting of airfields were viewed very positively by the Army and the Navy in China, and the latter explicitly considered it vital for the success of strategic bombing. They saw them as linked. One couldn't work without the other.
I mean, we definitely see that sort of at the start of the war, not for China, but for the US and the Brits, for example. Then in 1941, at least in the start of the war in the Pacific, where the Japanese army specifically launches quite an aggressive sort of OCA, so offensive counter-air campaign in Malaya, all the way into fighting around Singapore. And also, I think you've noticed this also in our bomber episode that we've probably put out already, that the airfield targeting was something that the Japanese did really rather well, especially early on in sort of the Pacific War. But as we're already now in World War II, how do those tactics then of fighter sweeps and aggressive OCA campaigns sort of work out in the Asian Pacific theater 1941 following?
So, of course, anyone familiar with more familiar with the war against the Western Allies starting in December 41, I've been describing a lot of this. I'm sure it's very familiar to a lot of them because this is like right down to the letter pretty much what they are doing in the opening offensives as they are sweeping out to long range. They're sending in fighter sweeps. They're shooting down anything they can find. They're strafing airfields. They're bombing airfields in the Philippines, Malaya, and elsewhere. And they lay waste to Allied air power in the opening campaigns. I mean, in fact, I'm not going to say it's unknown, but I mean, everyone focuses on the attacks on the ships and during Pearl Harbor, but they forget that the Japanese wipe out effectively American air power in Hawaii during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this is part of their MO.
Oh, I have to really stop myself from asking you about that mythical third wave, which we know isn't did never
Oh
exist, but
my
I know it's going to
god!
come up, and that is actually another video topic that I will note down now.
Okay.
We are going through new video topics as as we go by, but please continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
So, as far as like one detail that you don't see come up as often in particularly the opening campaigns, because they really just don't need to do it, is using bombers as bait to draw out fighters. So that was something that stemmed in China from in China in particular. It was usually a reluctance of Chinese interceptors when they were really down on strength and things to want to intercept anything that had fighter escort, like particularly by 41. So this wasn't really relevant. However, they reheated it in the microwave, so to say, during the Guadalcanal campaign for a very different reason, and that reason was initially in the Guadalcanal campaign, the G4Ms, the Navy bombers, were taking such heavy losses that they were like, okay, we need to change tactics significantly. So what they started doing is they would send in a flight of bombers with a whole bunch of Zeros. They knew roughly where the Americans would pick them up on radar or observers would see them. The bombers would slip out and turn back to Rabaul, and what the Americans would end up facing was a swarm of very angry Zeros unencumbered by bombers. And this did actually meet with some success. Of course, the Japanese kind of kept doing it a few too many times, and the Americans are going to figure out what you're doing eventually. But they did pull that whole bomber bait out back against the Americans for part of the Guadalcanal campaign. Now, there was nothing inherently wrong with offensive counter air, these tactics that they were employing, but of course they met with mixed results beyond the initial campaigns, and that's simply just, I would argue, due to the powerful air strength of the Western Allies. So perhaps some of the most famous examples of this were the Japanese Navy's failure to neutralize Henderson Field and Guadalcanal, or the numerous airfields that grew up around Port Moresby, as they kept hitting them over and over and over and over again, and the Allies kept getting back up, and the Allies were hitting back as well. And as with pretty much the story of the whole South Pacific Air Campaign, I've described it before as kind of two sides come up to each other and start punching each other in the face, and eventually the Japanese fell over.
Yeah, I mean, for the air war, that analogy is very good. Considering now sort of that they did this sort of bait and switch, right, where they send out bombers with a whole bunch of fighters, and then just use the fighters to draw in the American interceptors. In what way? Because you've noticed in the bomber episode that one of the problems that they have is they are flying at these extreme ranges, which makes them obviously predictable, because there's only going to be a certain time window where they're going to be able to actually conduct the operation. So they fly off in the morning, they're arriving in the area roughly at the same time, not every day, but when they pull off these sort of operations. Does this not create also sort of problems for the fighters then, of sort of attritionally speaking, this distance that they have to fly, plus then the losses that they will surely sustain in combat compared to the sort of the Allied losses? And then, of course, we have to factor in the whole strategic situation with the Japanese not really being able to re-equip their fighter wings as quickly.
Yeah, like as far as the Guadalcanal campaign goes, I mean, I've described it before as an unrelenting nightmare for the Japanese Navy Air Service. I mean, imagine you're like a Zero pilot. You have to get up really early in the morning. You may or may not have, be dealing with recovering from malaria or something fun like that because you're in the South Pacific. Yeah. You climb into your Zero. You have to fly, over 4 hours one way, and then you're often, like, your experience was you fly all of that way. The Americans are already above you because they have early warning and they know roughly when you're going to show up anyway. They make a diving pass through your formation. They shoot down a bunch of your bombers. You barely get to return any fire because they just dive away. And then you fly for about 4 hours back. And when you start thinking about things in that way, even outside attritional losses and things like that, one thing that might surprise some people is that morale which we don't often talk about with the Japanese because they're often kind of, I would almost say, denigrated as like these automatons who have no fear or whatever. It's like, no, they're people. And morale at Rabaul, like as this campaign draws out, starts to sag because they realize they're like, okay, none of us are going to be going home. We're flying these missions, like we barely get to even do anything a lot of the time. We're like losing all of our friends. Like I keep getting sick. It's really draining and difficult on them. And then of course over time, as people are shot down, they are replaced by air crew that are less and less experienced. And it's not just the fighter pilots; it's the bomber crews as well. In fact, they're some of the earliest and hardest hit because the bomber crews take a lot of losses, and of course, it's usually about a 7-man crew in a G4M. And they were finding Allied interviews from some captured Japanese aviators later on, like in '43. They were finding that there were some Japanese air crew, I guess almost in air quotes, on board G4Ms that had absolutely no training, specialized training as air crew at all. They were just there to shoot a waist gun. But they weren't really contributing much of anything else, and they didn't really know what was going on. The Japanese also start to do things like reducing the number of pilots. So often early on in the war, they'd have 2 pilots in a G4M, and that would go down to 1 over time as well, because they're just trying to economize every way they can, just to try and save on manpower.
I think one of those early examples where they've lost a lot of bombers, wasn't it the 1942 attack on Lexington, where sort of the early Turkish shoot, you might say, of Bougainville, I believe it was.
Yeah, and we did a video on that, and it is actually one of the largest single-day losses of the G4M. I'd have to check the exact numbers. It might be, I don't think it's the largest, but it's at least top 3.
I mean, on the top of my head, it's like 3 or 4 of them came back.
Yeah, it was almost annihilation. It was a real bad day.
I will link that video, and then the people can fact check me on the video that we have done some years ago. Sometimes the numbers go, a bit hazy at times. I just realized that I have done the unforgivable when it comes to sort of the Pacific Air War and the Southeast Pacific, and we've only talked about the Navy. Does the Army mirror the experience of the Navy during World War II? Because we've briefly touched upon that, of course, with the early on campaign.
Yeah, broadly speaking, yes. Again, the caveat is going to apply that I can't say as much on the Army because the writing just isn't there, unfortunately. That being said, as far as like fighter sweeps and this aggressive counter air goes, yes, the Army is all on board for that. Again, they have that aerial exterminating action. They're a big fan of it. They also, of course, have a lot of Army cooperation duties. That's probably the single aspect that is most underwritten. So if you've noticed with this whole series of videos, I haven't really talked at all about close air support. And it's because the amount of writing that I have seen in English or the usable Western observations are so small that I really have not a whole lot to say, unfortunately. So if anybody who has advanced language skills and in Japanese and wants to write on Japanese Airpower, do something on the Japanese Army and then also do stuff on CAS because there's nothing.
Or just leave it to Claringbold because he's coming out with a lot of stuff as well.
One day he'll get to it, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that brings me to sort of to the points of sourcing. As always with our videos, the sources are going to be in the description below, and there you can also find some recommendations for yourself. If you are interested in the subject, and we'll have an extensive list there as always. But the sourcing issue, I think we are starting to see, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because you're the primary expert in this regard with the Pacific. We have 2 historiographies. We have the Japanese historiography of the air war and the war in general in Japanese, and we have then, of course, the Anglo-American, with, of course, Australia, New Zealand, and all these subsidiaries of the British Empire. Some people are going to get angry that I said that, attached to that as well, with their history. But a lot of the stuff that English-speaking historians, of course, have to rely on, and initially that was that was probably a good thing that information was available, is intelligence reports and interrogation and what basically was translated, which was not a lot from Japanese. But now, coming to my point, is that we're starting to see the Japanese historiography opening up a little bit more, and that things get translated, or also that researchers that have Japanese language skills go over there and come up with some very interesting observations that completely shatter some of the things we've known before.
And it's a slow process, but it is happening. I mean, it's taking decades, literally. Like as with certain areas that aren't seeing like huge amounts of movement very quickly in the historiography, it does just take years and decades to course correct. And we are kind of entering that period where there are people like Michael Claring-Bold or John Lundstrom did decades ago, where they're starting to cross-reference records, which for anyone studying any air campaign, if you want to know specifics, like roughly as far as they can be known, how many aircraft are being lost on both sides and everything, you have to be looking at the operational records and cross-referencing them between both sides. You just, there's no other way to do it properly. And hopefully, like into the future, I hope there's just still, we just continue that trend and there's more people talking back and forth. I know there's a pretty lively, if not though small, community of aviation historians that some study are specializing in the American stuff, some study specializing in the Japanese or other nations that were involved, and they're constantly talking back and forth. There's a book coming out that I don't know how it'll be yet because it's not out yet, that I saw that's going to be like the first volume of stuff on the air war in China, written by a couple of Chinese gentlemen, and I'm really excited to read that, to see what they'll bring to the table on that side of things. And I think it's pretty exciting, even if it is again moving along slowly. And yeah, like I mean, I even picked up some cool stuff when I was over in Japan. My Japanese is atrocious, but I can have a look at. I bought an entire book because, of course, you know, my undying love is the G3M, and I bought an entire giant book on it that I've looked through, and it's also beautiful photographs and everything like that. And maybe one day more of that'll come into English. So yeah, I want to emphasize again that like when I'm pointing out that like over relying on American overclaiming is a problem, it's not me singling out the Americans. It's just from speaking from a historical perspective, it's just a limitation in the sourcing that leads to skewed conclusions. And one interesting thing I read a few years ago on a unit history that was written, I think, by Henry Sakita and another gentleman, on 343 Kokutai, which is like a famous Japanese late war fighter unit. It's kind of their magical ace unit in the late war period. And they were talking about the Japanese historiography that's been written on it, and they're doing the exact same thing. They're like, you know, they were shooting down scores and scores of American aircraft, overwhelmingly successful. And of course, when they started comparing with American records, even if they were still, you know, succeeding to a degree under the circumstances that were imposed upon them, it was nowhere near what sole sourcing from Japanese operational records would indicate.
I mean, that's the exciting part of history as anyway, because we constantly learn and relearn what we knew before, and as new sources got unearthed and so on. And sometimes that, you know, leads us to question some things we held dear and we thought we knew, and we all thought we understood something very well, but new sources appear, and then you just gotta reevaluate everything you knew, and that's just part of history. So if you have any questions on this topic or want to provide additional feedback, some additional insights as well, put them in the comments below. As always, we're always interested to see those, and if you have the sources on that, even better, put them with the comments. Okay, so in the first episode of what may actually become a series then on Japanese aviation technology, I want to talk about bombers, and then of course have the exciting fighters as the second topic for today. But bombers are, even though the fighters get all the credit, or rather the excitement and the intention during World War II, bombers are really the sort of the main strike force. And there is much more to the Japanese aviation bomber fleet than just focusing on the Navy with the G4Ms, the belly bombers, which tend to get the lion's share of the attention, especially in the more popular accounts of the Pacific Air War. So if you were to look at sort of bombers, and we're starting once again where we should start, and that is in the 1930s with the air war in China. How is sort of the Japanese bomber technology and the development progressing there?
Mm-hmm. So at the outset of the war, in very general terms, the army is almost completely obsolete as far as their bombers go, and the Navy is just starting to see the entry to service of the G3M, which was at that time a very high performance, brand new bomber. As far as their single engine carrier stuff goes, it was actually largely obsolete. As I mentioned before previously, like particularly very early in the war, even though the assumption would be the Japanese always have a technological advantage over the Chinese, in some aircraft categories, very early on, the Chinese have better stuff that they've imported from the Americans or have from the Soviets than the Japanese have in frontline service. Now, as far as the impact that the war in China has on the development of Japanese bomber technology, it's pretty significant. So just to take one relatively obscure example, the Tupolev SB-2, the Soviet twin-engine light bomber, kind of spearheaded a lot of Chinese Air Force raids against Japanese airfields, and the type really impressed the Japanese because their fighters were struggling to intercept them due to their high speed. And the Japanese Army Air Service looked at that, and they set out a requirement for a similar aircraft in December 1937. That aircraft would become the Ki-48 twin-engine light bomber, which entered service in the fall of 1940. Now, I'm sure there's probably a lot of people listening that are like, the what? Yeah, it's not exactly on the top shelf of Japanese military aircraft of the period. It developed a poor reputation against the Western Allies. It was too slow to avoid interception. It had weak defensive armament, poor fuel tank protection, at least initially, a modest bomb load, initially no armor, although that came along in a big way later on. And it just wasn't popular with Japanese air crews either. So when they were operating in the South Pacific, the Japanese air crews, even when it started adding lots of armor, they would strip all of it out because they were just trying to get the thing to climb. So, yeah, not the best reputation. Now, some of those weaknesses were inherent to the aircraft type, which was the interwar high-speed twin-engine bomber concept, typified by the SB-2 and the Bristol Blenheim. That was on its way out by the time the Ki-48 entered service, and later in its life, it would actually be converted into a somewhat serviceable dive bomber. The Ki-48's main claim to fame actually was that it had a bad habit of being destroyed on the ground in the South Pacific. But without the war in China, this bomber may never have come into existence because it was a straight line from, hey, we saw this bomber that we were fighting in China, we want one just like it. Now, another example that I can point to that ended up in failure but it's interesting because it parallels other air forces, is they found that they needed to provide bomber escort in China over long distances, and this was a great technological problem in the 1930s. So that both air services invested in the escort gunship concept, modified bombers with heavy protection and defensive armament meant to fly on the edges of bomber formations. So on the Navy side, a small number of G3M2s were converted into escort gunship prototypes, but then that project was killed when the stellar performance of the G4Ms, the Betty, that prototype caught the attention of the Japanese Navy, and they're like, hey, well, let's add partial fuel tank protection and heavier defensive armament, and it resulted in the G6M1, which was a wing-type escort fighter. It was quickly discovered that the concept was unworkable as they could no longer keep pace with the bombers after they dropped their bombs, and then the handful of G6M1s were converted into transports. So really, in the end, the project only served to delay the entry into service of the G4M1 by almost an entire year because they were tinkering with this escort concept.
And what was sort of the thing that caught the Japanese attention with the Betty bomber then, or the Navy's attention?
It was very high performance, particularly considering, of course, at that point their mainline bomber was the G3M. Excellent aircraft, but showing its age, as any aircraft will eventually. And they were really impressed with the G4M prototype. It was proceeding very well. And they're like, hey, well, let's start stapling a bunch of stuff to it and get it to escort things. And before you know it, a year had passed. And they were finally like, okay, well, let's make it back into a bomber. And there's similar examples in the Army as well. So there was a Ki-49 derived prototype escort fighter, and I can't remember the key designation for it. I have a photograph of it somewhere as well. But they were playing around with the exact same stuff, and it failed the exact same way. One thing that I think was a very positive direction for as far as bomber development goes, and the war in China, is a substantial increase in bomber defensive armament. So the Chinese, like anybody sending their bombers into actual contested environments for the first time, they've realized that their bombers are way too vulnerable compared to what they had thought previously. The early variants of the G3M, for example, only had 3 rifle caliber machine guns, so very common interwar armament for those interwar twin engine bombers.
And where were those positioned?
They had, so in retractable turrets, for one thing, which was kind of novel, but 1 ventral and 2 dorsal retractable turrets.
Okay.
This eventually increased in later models of the G3M as a direct result of combat experience in China to 2 waist gunners, rifle caliber, 1 dorsal rifle caliber turret, and a 20 millimeter dorsal position facing to the rear.
And that required an increase of manpower then as well.
Yeah, more gunners on board.
Yeah.
The design requirement for that would be for what would become the G4M, so the successor aircraft, was updated because originally they weren't going to have a 20 millimeter tail gunner. And then again, the combat experience in China, and they sent out a revision to the specification. They're like, we want a tail gunner and we want it to be a 20 millimeter. That was directly as a result of combat experience in China.
Which is very substantial if you think about it, even during World War II. I mean, there were very few bombers that had cannons, like literally sort of 20 millimeter cannons or upwards as defensive armament. They do start to appear a little bit every now and then. But I think the Japanese are the only one to do this consistently from before World War II even for them.
Yeah, they were pretty early on that train. Yeah, and that's a whole other discussion we can have on like.
I'll write it down. We keep coming up with new topics.
Yeah, the Type 99, the flexible mount, it had merits, but it also had issues. But yeah, we can talk about that someday, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then the similar pattern for the Army. So the Ki-21, their bomber that entered service in 38, again, it's very common interwar, 3 rifle caliber machine guns, 1 dorsal, 1 ventral facing backward, and then 1 in the nose, increased substantially. And while I don't usually bring up War Thunder, if you want to look at what it ended up being before they went to the Ki-21-2. They have a lovely model in the Japanese tech tree. It's one of the premiums, but you can look at it, of just what they had done to the Ki-21-1 by just as a direct result of combat experience in China. They put a machine gun everywhere that one would fit, and one where literally it normally wouldn't, but it was actually a stinger position in the tail. They couldn't get a guy in there, but they set up a stinger system instead.
I mean, that's the good thing with War Thunder. They do have the visual models of all these aircraft, and it is actually quite interesting sometimes to jump in and see that progression of the aircraft and what they retained and what they didn't retain. So I wouldn't call it a research experience, but if you're ever sort of interested in a line of aircraft, having a visual representation of it in front of you that is relatively accurate is a good thing.
And then the follow-on Ki-49, so the bomber that was intended to replace the Ki-21, that from the design specification, they wanted lots of defensive armament in that.
Okay. I mean, the Ki-49 is an interesting aircraft in itself, and I think we're also going to talk about that a little bit later on then. But now to mix it up a little bit and go with the exciting stuff, and that is fighters. Aircraft technology, development, fighters. Now, this is a big thing for the Japanese, I think specifically because of aircraft protection. But if we don't bracket that, let's bracket aircraft protection off for now and just go with the fighters in itself. How do those develop sort of coming out of China or even pre-China to then what we see early on in World War II? Conscious of the fact, of course, that we have the Navy and the Army.
So I think a common sentiment you'll see is that there's an assumption that the maneuverability of like the Zero and the Ki-43, the Hayabusa for the Army, came as a direct result of Chinese combat experience. And honestly, I personally disagree, because if you look further back, you can see that the advocates for maneuverability above all else versus the people that want higher speed, better dive performance, etc., they've been fighting each other all the way back into the early 1930s at least. And there were aircraft competitions where, in fact, the one of the aircraft that eventually the Ki-27 would beat out. So this is like the Army fighter with fixed landing gear. It was the predecessor of the Ki-43, stupendously maneuverable fighter. I think it's actually a very beautiful interwar fighter, even out of fixed landing gear, very nice lines. it beat out an aircraft that was less maneuverable but better dive performance, higher speed, etc. So this squabbling was going on before the war in China, and then it went all the way through the war in China, and it stretched it to a degree into the Asia Pacific War itself. So the war in China I don't see as a watershed one way or the other. And when you're looking at some of the debates that we do have access to, you have proponents of maneuverability above all else. They go, well, look at this combat example in China. And then the other people go, well, look at this other combat example in China where better dive performance would have helped. So they're really just weaponizing their Chinese combat experience to entrench themselves in the positions that they already found themselves in.
And I think just to stress this point, when you say maneuverability, what you mean is that sort of low speed maneuverability that leans a little bit, not necessarily, I mean, you have roll performance as well, but leans into sort of the turn and burning, typical sort of going in a circle, trying to outturn the adversary, because obviously there is high speed maneuverability as well, which is incredibly important once you go sort of in the booming and zooming. But it's interesting how this sort of discussion is something that if we go to the big picture and have sort of this face-off between the people that want a more sort of heavier, more capable sort of in terms of carrying power, as well as the systems that are on board and the performance that the airplane offers over something a little bit more lighter, a little bit maneuverable, you find that time and time again. I mean, if you could probably make a big picture comparison even to the development of the F-15 or the F-16 than in the US and in during the Cold War. Although I think that will require a completely different video to actually branch that out and look at sort of the ebbs and flows of what the requirements are and who the proponents are and what sort of arguments they have. But yeah, in the end, sort of the Japanese army ends up with that nimble K-43, the Hayabusa, and the Navy ends up with the Zero. Where would you say on balance is this dividing line between those?
So as far as like low speed maneuverability goes, so the Zero, of course, has a reputation for being very maneuverable at low speeds, and it was. The Ki-43-1, as I've mentioned a couple videos ago, was on another level. Like they were operating on a different plane of existence when they came up with the specifications for the Ki-43-1, because they really did want basically a biplane but a monoplane.
Which is crazy if you think about, like, wasn't it the designer of the Zero in his latest biography about how he designed the aircraft, saying that it was basically impossible specifications that were given to him, and somehow they made it work. But with the Hayabusa, it's even beyond that.
Oh yeah, it was ridiculous, and it's why the Ki-43 took like a year longer than the Zero to enter service, is because Nakajima was really struggling with it. In fact, the first Ki-43 prototypes that were sent to evaluation to the Army were rejected. The Army was like, it's not maneuverable enough, it's not good enough.
Try again.
Yeah, try again. And Nakajima, to their credit, like as an engineering feat, they managed to, like, they developed butterfly combat flaps actually for the Ki-44, which was being developed in parallel, but they were ported over to the Ki-43, and these were flaps that could be deployed in combat that would increase the wing area and further improve low speed maneuverability if they needed it. Apparently in combat, Ki-43 pilots didn't actually use them that much because you were already so stupendously maneuverable, but they added that. They did a few other modifications, and it ended up finally being accepted by the Army, but it was a very difficult development period. And Nakajima, it turns out, has probably I guess it's an unfortunate distinction of the Ki-43 in very early production models was the only Japanese aircraft that was legitimately structurally weak. Because you always hear about that all these Japanese aircraft are fragile. They're not. At least structurally speaking, they're not.
They're rated to the same structural strength, roughly speaking, to the Americans, sometimes above that even. So
yeah.
But that gives us into this discussion of like structural strength versus like strength under fire, if you want to make that distinction, which is a big one. And I think we had a video on that already in the past, a couple of years ago. Memory goes a bit hazy there. But if I remember, I will put it up there. But please continue, yeah.
Yeah, so but what ended up happening in these early production models of the Ki-43 is that they'd shaved too much weight somewhere structurally, and they were finding that under aerodynamic loads, the wings were developing cracks, and there were actually a few pilot deaths that resulted from wings separating from the aircraft.
Try again.
They obviously zeroed in on this very quickly, and they offered reinforcement and things like that. Although the stigma towards like the structural strength of the Ki 43-1 did carry on in Army pilots. They were a little uneasy about the aircraft until basically the Ki 43-2, so the successor model that like substantially added weight and things like that. So even if it was fixed in early production, you could see the echoes of that fear of, I mean, no pilot wants to have their wings separating from the aircraft in flight. But that's just a directly resulted from these ridiculous specifications for extreme low weight and low speed maneuverability out of the Army. And of course, again, Horikoshi on the Navy side for the Zero had many of these same struggles, but the Navy, to its credit, was a little bit more like it let him cook a little bit more than the Army did with Nakajima. And in fact, in his memoir, Horikoshi mentions that after one particularly heated meeting where they were complaining about how the plane wasn't maneuverable enough, he went back and he sketched out what they would have wanted, and he omitted the 20 millimeter cannons, and he shaved off even more weight. And to his credit, he looked at it and he's like, "This is not going to upgrade at all. It's going to be obsolete basically upon arrival, and I'm not going to do it." And he gave the Navy what they'd originally asked for anyway, and it ended up, I personally, in my opinion, and people can disagree, I think that the Zero overall was a better aircraft than the Ki 43.
No, I think I would agree with you. And also, if we consider sort of at what the requirements were and what was necessary for sort of a long range fighter for the Navy. I mean, the Zero, when it comes out, and even in 1942 and even in 1943, I mean, that's where things start to unravel a little bit, but we can have another video on that. I mean, it's an absolutely sensational Navy fighter. No question about it. I mean, it really is to the credit of Horikoshi and you know the whole team of making that possible. I mean, we had actually I sat in a Zero not too long ago in the US at the Flag and Fighters World War II Museum in Grand Falls, Minnesota. You should absolutely go there because they have a beautiful A6M3, and you do see like how they managed to get this aircraft to that point where it fit roughly the specifications, and going any further than that would have probably not recreated the outstanding fighter it was. But credit where credit is due. I mean, for the time, it was absolutely magnificent in many ways. Overshadowed then, of course, what happens on later on, which neatly goes into my next question, that is aircraft protection, right? So that this is probably the one thing next to the structural strength that the most criticism is leveled at the Japanese. I would say the Zero and the Betty bombers overshadow the debate a little bit beyond what what other designs the Japanese used, especially the Army, which did not use the Bettys or the Zero. But let's go back again, as we always have to China. What sort of lessons were drawn from China in relation to aircraft armor and fuel tank protection, similar to the experiences that a lot of European countries had then with their observations from the Spanish War, I guess?
So the lessons drawn from the war in China related to aircraft armor and fuel tank protection it's more interesting than people would popularly assume. The concept that Japanese aircraft of the mid to late 1930s were uniquely unprotected is incorrect. The use of armor and protected fuel tanks, particularly in fighters, was not widespread among the world's air forces until 41, really. I mean, the tipping point in Europe is in 1940. The F4F, just as one example that's very relevant, would enter the Asia-Pacific War like into 42 without armor or fuel tank protection. Those were retrofitted.
Wasn't it the retrofit sort of like the famous boilerplate that was put in?
Yeah, and then when they installed the self-sealing tanks, of course, it was doing things like it was screwing with the fuel gauges, and there were leaks with the early tanks. And in fact, it was only they'd repaired the tanks at a lot of the F4Fs that would end up participating in the Coral Sea like very shortly before the battle. So there's, I guess, like a hypothetical out there where they run into more hiccups, and then you're almost out of F4Fs before the Battle of the Coral Sea even starts because of leaking fuel tanks and other issues.
And let's sort of forget that en masse, fighter pilots, whether they were European or American, or probably also Soviet, although I don't have a specific example there, were against fuel tank protection and were against armor because they felt armor made their aircraft less responsive, and protected fuel tanks generally lower the range of the aircraft because more volume is taken
through the protection of the fuel tank. And there you go, you lose range. And that's also the reason why some planes, like for example, the Air Cobra, came out without any protective fuel tanks, because they already had such limited range to begin with, coming out stock at the factory line. And then I think this is something that you said a long time ago in our aircraft protection video, is there is no such thing as just a protected fuel tank. There are different types of protective fuel tanks with just layering of sort of wrapping over to then sort of the self-expanding foam or the self-expanding rubber and so on, and it's a whole technological debate that is a bit too grand for this video, but there is no such thing of just snipping your fingers and protect a fuel tank, and it's always of the same quality. There's different kinds of that. But going back to China, sorry that I keep interrupting you here with these observations.
Yeah. So of course, with the war in China, the Japanese air services were kind of in a position where they were uniquely positioned to assess the need for aircraft protection relatively early. And both the Army and Navy rapidly identified that the flammability of their bombers operating in China was a problem. However, the Army and Navy took two very different approaches to address it. So in late 1938, the Army reviewed the combat performance of their Ki-21 in China. In response, the first improved variant received partially protected fuel tanks. So this was the metal tanks, but they had a wrapping material around, like rubber lining.
Yeah.
This was before similar American and British bombers received any fuel tank protection whatsoever. The Ki-21 would see further improvements in fuel tank protection, and the addition of armor would be added in later variants. The design specification, as I mentioned earlier, for the Ki-21 successor also called for heavy armor protection and fuel tank protection from its inception. So the Army was very much looking to, we need to add lots of these passive protection features to our aircraft. Now, it took longer for Army fighters to receive armor protection. That had more to do with just the slow development cycle of new Japanese aircraft models than it did for like any stubbornness on the part of the need to add protection. The Ki-43-1, as light as it was, I mean, it had rudimentary fuel tank protection from early production. Again, it was a very basic kind of protected fuel tank, and they found that particularly in the tropical heat, it wasn't super effective, but they were trying. And then from the introduction of the Ki-43-2, so in 1942, the significantly improved model of the Ki-43, that was the one that saw the installation of a 13mm armored backplate and headrest as standard, and then it further improved fuel tank protection from there. In sharp contrast, the Japanese Navy Air Service only drew, really, I would argue, what they wanted to from their experience in China. So despite the proven vulnerability of the G3M to catching fire, the Navy, in the words of the historian Osamu Tagaya, pushed a set of, quote, fundamentally unreasonable, unquote, demands for maximum performance in its successor, the G4M. Now, the logic behind this is that the Navy believed the China War had demonstrated an increase in bomber performance, and the introduction of effective fighter escort had made bomber armor and fuel tank protection redundant. The Navy wasn't completely wrong, but they overlooked two key issues. So the first is that the nature of Chinese aerial resistance was more accommodating than what the Navy would face against the air forces of great powers. The second was more critical in my view, and that's that the Navy's RICO, the land-based attack aircraft, these bombers, their primary task was to support the fleet, not to bomb at high level like cities. And to support the fleet, they'd be doing things like conducting torpedo attacks or low-level horizontal or glide bombing attacks against ships, which means they are not hiding up at high altitude. So they're exposed to way more anti-aircraft fire. They don't have the safety of altitude to try and avoid enemy interceptors. Their own fighter escort is not going to be down on the deck with them, trying to keep everything off them. So they're going to be taking hits, a lot more hits than operating the way they were in China. Now, as it turned out, when the G4M was able to operate under conditions they'd envisioned at higher altitudes with sufficient fighter escort, bombing land targets, their losses were actually quite reasonable. And we have very detailed, thanks to Michael Claringbold and Peter Ingman, we have detailed tables of like loss rates for G4Ms through 1942 in the South Pacific Air War, and they're not that high when it comes to conducting high-level bombing attacks. with the one exception of Guadalcanal, because the Americans were able to get lots of early warning and climb up above them and hit them consistently in operations. But when they were used in their other intended role, torpedo attacks on ships, arguably their primary role as the RICO was envisioned by Admiral Yamamoto and the Japanese Navy, the losses were frequently appalling. Like these are all of this, like every single one of the single highest day loss rates for Japanese G4M bomber losses involved anti-shipping and attacking at lower altitudes, either horizontal or torpedo bombing. And you can debate until you're blue in the face how much fuel tank and armor protection would have reduced these, but it would have done something.
Yeah.
Like when you're having that much shrapnel around you and that many 20 millimeter shells flying around and things like that, like having some of that protection, particularly fuel tank protection, would have saved bombers. And now the Japanese Navy, they began to take aircraft protection a bit more seriously from 1944, adding it to more of their aircraft, including the Zero. But of course, by then they had way bigger problems to contend with. I guess one anecdote I can give you that's kind of interesting is that ironically, the Zero, the poster child of a lack of aircraft protection, by 1945, it was actually the heaviest protected heaviest protected Japanese Navy aircraft for its size of the war. It had an 8 millimeter backplate. It had armored windscreen behind the pilot. It had armored windscreen in front of the pilot. It had automatic fire extinguishers for the fuel tanks. It held self-sealing fuel tanks. It, it actually had pretty good protection, but it took them so long to get there. It's basically irrelevant. Like that version of the Zero started entering service in 45 when they needed a new aircraft that wasn't a Zero to begin with.
I mean, at that point, it's almost like you're trying to save the sand pit in your garden with a little hose as the house is starting to catch fire. It's just I'm wondering then. So the Navy has this, and does this stem out of the fact that they have to operate at range? Because if you're operating at range, you want to have less weight on you that you cannot drop as ordnance, and you need a more fuel. And as I said earlier, when you redesign a fuel tank in order to have some sort of self-protection, then either you have to redesign the wing if it's in the wing, or the internal structure if the fuel tank is in the internal structure, or you have to decrease the volume. Is this like the primary reason, or is this something they didn't see the writing on the wall? Where do these issues come from? Because I assume that if they reduce the range of the bombers, they suddenly have that problem of, oh, we have to build now airfields and we have to build up a better support infrastructure for our bomber wings, and we don't have that yet. Because this is something that you've mentioned before in a previous video that I've marked down also as an additional video maybe in the future of aircraft or like airfield construction. Is this sort of, is that the main reason as to why they didn't go this route?
Yes, as far as I can tell, it is primarily a concern of range. The Navy is very sensitive as far as the operational range of their aircraft. Speaking broadly of the Navy, they had a philosophy of outranging the enemy. This was a philosophy that even stretched to the surface fleet and other elements of their forces, but it played into a part with the aircraft as well. And they were very aware that they needed these operational ranges to fulfill the role that they thought they needed to fulfill. And you could see, even in the case where it didn't add protection, but they were improving performance in other areas and it led to a range drop, it was pushed back on quite fiercely in the Navy. The big example of that is the A6M3, which doesn't have a good reputation, and I will die on the hill that is actually quite a good fighter, and it was a marked improvement over the Model 21, the A6M2 that it was supposed to replace, but the range dropped on it because of the higher fuel consumption of the engine. They had a little bit more weight, that kind of thing. And they couldn't reach Guadalcanal from Rabaul, and the Navy was like, what the hell is this? And I think in part, and this part is me a little theory crafting a little bit, it's in my gut, is I think that was probably a major part of why they didn't add protection into the Zero in particular earlier than they did. Is that they were like, we can't add anything more to it that reduces operational range, because the very next variant of that Zero, the main purpose of it was to restore the operational range they'd lost with the A6M3. They do finally accept a notable range drop with the A6M5, but by that point in the war, they're starting to shift onto a more defensive footing. And with the G4M, it's a similar story. They want that operational range. They want to save every single kilogram of weight to maximize the aircraft's performance. And while they do start to add some rudimentary fuel tank protection and all that through 43 and then into 44, and it improves from there, you see those operational ranges drop. And of course, the broader context is that they are shifting more and more onto the defensive, and they finally start to come to grips with the fact that operational range isn't the be all and end all, and that they're fighting a defensive war and they need aircraft that can take hits.
I mean, also at this point, that when they're starting to fight a defensive war, I assume that not all of the ranges, but some of the ranges start to drop, and they don't actually have the requirement to fly at these ridiculous sorties that we have already discussed in the past. Although I would say, I mean, on the surface level, sort of there's this philosophy of outranging the enemy. Although for Navy, of course, it makes sense. It does appear to be quite a bold strategy for a resource scarce country. Although when you then sort of think about it in the context, actually centralizing resources there and getting one sortie instead of maybe 1.5 sorties out of things does perhaps actually start to make sense a little bit there. But then going away from the Navy, the Army features, and maybe this is sort of as our closing discussion on this, the Army comes up with a bomber that is probably one of the most well-protected bombers of the whole war. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, and that is the Army went a very different direction. I guess you could call it a more European-American direction, like a more typical direction for fighter and bomber protection, in that they recognized the need. They needed to improve pilot and airframe survivability, and they invested quite a bit of effort into doing it. And the Key 49, as you mentioned, was stupendously well protected. You could even argue probably overprotected for an aircraft of its size, because its reputation, particularly the Key 49-1, was that it was underpowered. And when you look at the amount of armor protection that was shoved into this thing, plus the protected fuel tanks, the number of defensive gunners, you could start to see, okay, this might go a large way toward explaining why pilots felt it was underpowered. One curious thing of the Key 49 is that it was never popular in the Japanese Army service. The pilots didn't like it. They thought it flew like crap compared to the Key 21. Very heavy on the controls. Then when the Americans capture the Key 49 and you read like evaluations of the Key 49 for them, they're like, it's fine. It's just that skewed perception, because apparently by reputation the Key 21 flew like a sports car as far as a twin engine bomber was concerned. So
very sort of interwar legacy there.
Yeah. And yeah, the Key 49 was stupendously well protected. The Key 48, as they added armor to it, very well protected. I think the Key 48, the 49 might have it too, but I think the 48 has like a 16.5 millimeter big plate in it somewhere. Like, and I mentioned before how, like, with the Key 48, like some of the pilots in the South Pacific, because they needed them to climb over mountains, they were ripping all the armor out of them because they were trying to get them to climb.
16.5 millimeters, that's enough to stop a cannon round. I mean, generally speaking, for Luftwaffe, the Brits, even the Americans, the standard was around 8 to 10 millimeters armor protection, just to enough for basically heavy machine gun, but nobody tried to go the round of stopping cannons.
Yeah, like the Japanese Navy, Army, they tended to favor thick backplates. So if you look at like the protection layouts of a lot of American fighters, they might have like more armor coverage but thinner.
With deflector plates in there.
Yeah, and then with the Japanese Army, they tended to favor, like on fighters, a very thick backplate. And I'm pretty sure, I don't have an exact answer for this, but I think it's pretty intuitive to assume it's because they're coming up against so much American 50 caliber armor piercing. They're trying to provide protection against it. And for those curious, did this provide protection against it? Yes, actually, under some circumstances. And the Americans capture plates with holes in, not holes in them, but bullet impacts from 50 cal, and they stopped the 50 cal, no spalling. They did their own ballistics tests on captured armored plates, and they found that they were actually exceeding U.S. Army specifications for aircraft protection. Like, these were very serious armor plates. Of course, the downside to that was the Japanese tended to have less all-around protection in their fighters, so they would usually, like on the Key 43 2, they only had the thick armor backplate. They had no bullet-resistant windscreen. They had nothing in front of the pilot. So it was all directed to the rear. in the case of the Ki-43.
And that gives you protection at certain angles, then of course. But as you were mentioning, if anything is coming in from a different angle there, that's obviously not going to help that much either. And it is, as always, armor really is there, in at least in fighters, to protect the pilot, and basically a saving throw that, if you don't see your adversary diving on you and starting to shoot at you, which 9 times out of 10 we can assume that's how planes got shot down, then at least the pilot can bail out and survive. And Japanese pilots, yes, they did have parachutes.
Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes there are contextual reasons why sometimes they didn't have. But that is another video that we will do it in the future. Then I will write that down as well. If you have any questions on this topic, if you want to add anything, put it in the comments below. As always, if you want to add anything, also feel free to post your sources there. That is something we greatly encourage. All the sources for this video are also going to be in the description as always. Big thank you here, of course, to the channel supporters, because it is your support that allows us to do this. And then, of course, also a big thank you here to Justin for taking his time and bringing the expertise to the table, or rather the video.
Wow, if you're still here with us right now, that means that you went through this episode in full. Let us know what you thought in the comments, and see you on the next episode of our Japanese Airpower series. Have a great day, and see you in the sky.